There is a moment at the end of the first episode of Invincible where Nolan Grayson, in his red and white suit, walks into a windowless room beneath the planet and begins to hurt people he was supposed to die alongside. The Guardians of the Globe are slaughtered in a sequence that lasts only a few minutes, and it changes the entire shape of the story you are about to spend years watching. If you have read the comic, you know that is not where you first learned what Nolan was capable of. The comic kept that scene quieter, almost off to the side. The show made it the cliffhanger of episode 1, and that single decision, the order in which a viewer is told who Omni-Man really is one of hundreds of choices the show made when adapting one of the bloodiest, most ambitious superhero comics ever printed. Almost nobody talks about all of those choices in one place. Tonight, on Rock, we are going through everything the Invincible show changed, from the comic, from the giant structural rewrites, to the small visual ones that pass in a single shot. So get comfortable, we will be here a while, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. The first and largest thing the show changed about Invincible is the order in which the truth about Nolan Grayson is allowed to land. In the comic, the slaughter of the Guardians of the Globe happens essentially off the page. Robert Kirkman opens the 7th issue with the aftermath, the broken bodies, the blood, and Nolan Grayson lying among them, apparently as wounded as the rest. The reader is meant to be confused, sad, and suspicious in roughly that order. Damien Darkblood arrives to investigate. The mystery hangs over the early arc, and Mark himself is still entirely in the dark. Nolan plays the survivor, the grieving widower of the team, the man who almost died. The comic gives you a slow burn. It tells a detective story first and a tragedy second. The show takes that structure and inverts it entirely. The audience watches Nolan kill the Guardians directly, on screen, in close detail, before the credits of the very first episode have rolled. It is no longer a mystery whether he did it. The only question that remains, for 8 episodes, is why, and how long Mark will be allowed to keep his innocence about it. That single rewriting of order is the show's biggest adaptation choice, and almost every other change ripples outward from it. Once the audience knows what Nolan is, the writers have to find new ways to surprise them, to keep tension alive in scenes the comic could let simmer. They have to give Debbie a stronger interior life, because we already suspect what she is going to learn. They have to make Mark's blindness ache, because we can see what he cannot. The decision to front-load the truth is the spine of the show as an adaptation, and almost everything else that has been changed exists to support that opening choice. That rewriting also reshaped how the Guardians of the Globe themselves are introduced. In the comic, the Guardians appear briefly, in a few panels of camaraderie and 1 or 2 missions, and then they are dead. You learn who they were largely through context, through people grieving them, through the Justice League pastiche of their names, and the visual jokes their designs are making. The show, knowing it has to make the killing of these people hit harder, gives them a little more breathing room before it ends them. We see Aquarus and his pregnant wife in a domestic moment. We see War Woman and Green Ghost having drinks with each other. We see Martian Man trying to be friendly. We hear the Immortal speak. None of these moments take very long, but they are the first proper change the show makes to the comic's structure. The Guardians are made into people for 1/2 hour of television, and then they are erased, and the audience is given just enough familiarity to feel the loss as a loss, rather than as a plot point. The comic, with its more economical pacing, did not need to do this, because the Guardians were not meant to carry the weight of an opening cliffhanger. The show makes them carry it, and so the show has to build them up first. Of all the casting and adaptation choices in the entire series, the single most discussed is the recasting of the Immortal as a man, with a long romantic life that the comic only sketched. In the comic, the Immortal is a stiff Superman analog. He is dignified, slightly out of step with the modern world, and he meets and falls in love with Dupli-Kate, eventually marrying her in one of the comic's most emotionally direct arcs. The show keeps that romantic spine, but it changes the texture of how the Immortal carries his very long life. He is given more melancholy, more hesitance, and an explicit history with another long-lived hero whose presence the comic never developed in the same way. The show treats his immortality as a wound rather than a strength. It treats his eventual marriage to Kate as a small piece of light he has been waiting centuries for. The comic was sentimental about him. The show is mournful. That tonal shift in how a single supporting character is handled tells you something about how the writers approached the entire adaptation, because they kept doing it. They kept finding the bruise inside a character the comic had handled at arm's length, and they kept leaning their thumb into it. The Mauler twins, who in the comic appear and reappear as scientific antagonists with a very particular ongoing joke about which of them is the original and which is the clone, are introduced earlier in the show than they were on the page, and they are used as a structural through-line in a way the comic was not interested in pursuing. In the comic, the Maulers are funny, casually evil, and largely transactional. The show uses them as the secret laboratory behind several major plot beats. They build the Reanimen for Sinclair, they get hired by Robot, they get pulled into the Cecil orbit, and their bickering becomes a kind of dark Greek chorus that the comic version never really was. The change is not a betrayal of the Maulers, who are still funny and still casually evil, but a recognition that the show needs more recurring antagonists to fill out a season, and the Maulers can carry that weight if you let them. The audience starts to recognize them. Their banter becomes part of the rhythm of an episode. By the time the robot reveal comes around, the Mauler twins have been on screen so often that the choice to involve them in his deception feels both earned and inevitable, which is exactly the trick the show was trying to pull off. The revelation that Robot is not a robot at all, but a disabled young man named Rudolph Connors operating a remote drone from a hidden chamber, is one of the comic's slower mysteries. In the comic, you spend months reading Robot interact with the Teen Team and the Guardians before you ever see the human beneath the metal. The show, knowing it cannot afford that kind of long burn on television, accelerates the reveal substantially. By the end of the first season, the audience already understands that Robot is something more complicated than a machine, and by the early episodes of the second season, his entire scheme to grow himself a new body in a laboratory tube is fully on screen. The Mauler twins are involved earlier. The cloning vat is shown earlier. The new body, with its blonde hair and its terrible psychological weight, arrives sooner. The comic stretched all of this over years of monthly issues. The show condenses it into a handful of episodes, and in doing so, it makes Rudy's eventual decision to take the Mauler twins' genetic template, rather than his own, feel like a single sustained piece of self-loathing, rather than the diffuse identity crisis the comic depicted. The arc is the same arc. The shape of the suffering is different. The show treats Rudy's choice to become someone else as a horror story about disability and self-image. The comic, while it certainly does that, is also more interested in the science fiction of it. Both versions are honest. They are simply pointed at different things. Donald Ferguson, in the comic, is a quieter presence than the show eventually allows him to be. He works for Cecil, he gives orders to people, he occasionally has dialogue, and on the page his story develops in scattered moments across the run, including the eventual revelation that he is a cyborg whose original body was lost on a mission decades earlier. The show takes Donald and turns him into one of the most quietly devastating supporting characters in the entire series. He has, by most accounts, been killed and rebuilt many times. Cecil has been using him as a kind of disposable lieutenant, restoring his consciousness into a new body each time. And at some point, Donald begins to understand what has been done to him. The basic conceit, the cyborg revelation, is present in the source material, but the show develops it into something the comic only sketches. The Donald the comic gives us is largely a name and a roster, a man at a console, with his condition treated as a back pocket piece of lore. The Donald the show gives us is a haunted soldier who has died for Cecil more times than he has fingers to count, and the show treats his slow realization of this with a kind of clinical horror that the comic was not interested in lingering over. What that expansion tells you, more than anything, is how seriously the show takes the moral weight of Cecil Stedman as a character. The comic treats Cecil as ambiguous. The show treats him as ambiguous, but it also gives him a victim who is loyal to him, who serves him, who is in the same room as him every day, and who knows on some level that Cecil is the architect of his own ongoing torture. That single shift in emphasis reframes everything Cecil does in the show. It makes his pragmatism feel more sinister. It makes his protectiveness of Mark feel more conditional. It makes his late-game choices, when he begins to question himself, land harder, because we have been watching Donald carry the cost of him from the beginning. Cecil himself is more expanded in the show than he is in the comic. The comic version of Cecil Stedman is a powerful man with a lot of dialogue and a strong personality, but he is not given the kind of interiority the show eventually grants him. The show gives Cecil his own apartment, his own routines, his own divorce, his own moments of doubt with his subordinates, his own arguments with his own conscience. He becomes, by the middle of the second season, a character who could carry a side story on his own. The comic was always more interested in Cecil as a function, the man who runs the Global Defense Agency and represents the moral compromise of state power. The show keeps that function entirely intact, but it grafts onto it a private man who watches television in his bathrobe and who pulls at his collar when he has to lie to a teenager. The actor playing him, the writers behind him, the production decisions around him, all of them lean into giving Cecil the dignity of being a person rather than just a chess player. The clearest expression of this is the way the show stages his confrontations with Mark in the back half of the second season. The comic version of those confrontations is sharper, more clipped, more functional. The show version lingers. Cecil sweats. Cecil looks tired. Cecil knows he is making a choice he will have to carry, and the show lets you watch him do it. Amber Bennett is the largest single character expansion the show made to the comic. In the comic, Amber is Mark's college girlfriend. She finds out about his secret, she is angry and hurt about it, and she eventually leaves him in a way that feels both reasonable and predictable. She is a supporting character who exists, more or less, to dramatize Mark's failures at being honest with people he loves. The show takes her out of that supporting role and makes her one of the most important running emotional threads in the entire series. She is on screen far earlier. She is given a personality the comic only sketched. She is allowed to know about Mark's powers much sooner than the comic timeline permits. She has political opinions, organizing work, a richer family backstory, friends of her own, and arguments with Mark that the comic never staged. She is also, crucially, not always right. The show resists the easy version of this expansion, which would have been to turn her into a perfect girlfriend whom Mark fails to appreciate. Instead, she is allowed to be sharp-tempered, sometimes unfair, sometimes self-righteous, and sometimes correct about Mark in ways that hurt to hear. The relationship lasts longer in the show than it does in the comic, and when it ends with both of them having tried in a way the comic did not entirely depict. The change tells you everything about what the show is willing to spend time on. The comic, as a single creator project, was happy to use Amber as a plot beat. The show, with a writer's room and a cast, was unwilling to leave her at that level, and so she became a character. Adam Eve is given the largest standalone backstory the show has ever produced for any character outside the Grayson family. The comic gave Eve a difficult origin, a complicated relationship with her father, and a slow turn from teamwork to solo heroism, and most of those beats are scattered across many issues. The show takes a different approach. It pauses the entire forward momentum of its first season to give Eve a single episode devoted to her childhood, her powers as they manifested in infancy, the way her parents reacted to her, the secret that defined her early life, and the long arc of her trying to become herself in spite of all of that. The episode moves through years of her life in a single sitting. It tells you who she was at 4, at 7, at 12, at 16. It shows you her using her abilities to feed people without being asked, and to fix things she was never asked to fix, and to push back against parents who treat her like a project. By the end of the episode, you understand Eve in a way the comic spends years getting to. That structural decision, the choice to spend an entire episode of a short season on one supporting character's backstory, would have been impossible on the page in the same way. The comic has all the time in the world. The show has 8 episodes a year, and it chose to spend one of them on Eve. That choice tells you the writers loved her more than the comic's pacing was allowed to. It also tells you they wanted her to be a real possible future for Mark, not just a question mark. The show had to make Eve specific so that the audience would feel her absence whenever Mark was failing to choose her. The comic, by contrast, could be more matter-of-fact about her, because the page can revisit her whenever it wants. The relationship between Mark and Adam Eve is also accelerated and reshaped by the show. In the comic, their long, slow, on-and-off bond stretches over an enormous run of issues, and the eventual romantic resolution between them is the patient endpoint of years of friendship. The show keeps the same general direction, but it tightens the timeline considerably. Eve and Mark are clearly drawn to each other in the first season. They share more quiet moments earlier than they do in the comic. Their friendship is more openly tinged with attraction, with frustration, with longing, with the friction of two people who keep arriving at the same conversation from slightly different angles. The show is willing to let them flirt, fight, apologize, and circle each other in the way television couples have always done, and the comic was simply slower about it. The narrative purpose is the same, the pacing is different. And because the pacing is different, the eventual moments in which they fully come together carry a different weight. They feel like the cumulative answer to a question the show has been asking for years, rather than the result of two characters quietly maturing on the page. Debbie Grayson is the character whose interior life the show expanded most dramatically without changing the basic shape of who she is. In the comic, Debbie is loving, present, dignified, and devastated. She holds her composure for Mark, she helps him through the things he is too young to handle, and she carries her grief in a way that is admirable and somewhat distant. The show takes that exact same character, every quality intact, and gives her an entire emotional life that is rarely allowed on the page. She is shown alone in her kitchen. She is shown drinking too much, in a sustained subplot that lasts most of a season. She is shown going to a real estate office and trying to pretend she still cares about selling houses. She is shown lying in bed with the lights on, unable to be still. She is shown trying and failing to talk about Nolan to anyone who could possibly understand. None of those scenes have a direct comic equivalent. They are inferred. They are extrapolated. They are the writers asking, what did Debbie do at 3 in the morning during the months Mark was off planet? And then they answered the question on screen. The result is that Debbie becomes one of the central characters in the show, in a way she is in the comic, but only on a slow read. The show insists on Debbie. It refuses to let her be a function, and because of that, every Grayson scene in the second season feels different from its comic equivalent. The mother who once stayed in soft focus is now sharper, sadder, more present, and more visible. The Global Defense Agency itself is more carefully built into a believable institution than the comic ever bothered to make it. In the comic, the agency is a useful shorthand. It is a Black Ops outfit with bottomless resources, a building somewhere, a roster of operatives, and a moral logic that boils down to keeping the planet alive. That is enough on the page. The show wants more. It gives the agency hallways, conference rooms, motor pools, training facilities, briefing screens, and a real sense of the bureaucracy that surrounds Cecil. It populates it with named lieutenants who are allowed to disagree with him. It shows you what happens after a fight is over, when the bodies have to be moved and the streets have to be repaired, and the survivors have to be debriefed, and the families have to be told. The comic was content to imply all of that off-panel. The show keeps insisting on showing it. The result is that Cecil's power has texture in the show in a way it does not have on the page. You know the people Cecil orders around. You know what their offices look like. You know what kind of food they eat. And so when Cecil tells you that the world depends on him making the wrong call, you have to weigh that claim against the full apparatus of the people who help him make it. The show treats the agency as the second strongest character in the series after the Grayson family. The comic treated it as a convenience. Alan the Alien is one of the comic's most charming creations, a single member of an interstellar police force who is constantly underestimated by the people who set him to his tasks, and who becomes one of Mark's closest friends. The show keeps everything that works about Alan and then leans into his comic timing in a way the page could only approximate. The voice performance, the rhythm of his sentences, the dignity of his self-deprecation, all of that gives Alan a presence that the comic indicated rather than created. The relationship between Alan and Mark is also given more screen time and more weight than the equivalent stretch of the comic, particularly in the second season, where the two of them share extended sequences together in space hospitals, in alien bars, in waiting rooms full of injured warriors who have no idea what to do with their downtime. The comic is sparer about these scenes. The show is generous. Alan becomes more than he ever was in the comic, the friend Mark talks to about his father, his future, and his fear of becoming the thing he is afraid he might be. The expansion is not a contradiction of the source. It is an enlargement of it. The show treats Alan as essential, and the show gives him room to earn that treatment. Damien Darkblood is a different kind of expansion, more textural than structural. The comic uses Damien as a noir gag with consequences. He is a demon detective from hell who speaks in clipped grammatical fragments, and who is convinced, correctly, that Nolan murdered the Guardians. The show keeps every one of those elements and gives them a slightly different tonal register. The Damien of the show is a little more vulnerable, a little stranger, a little more unsettling to be in a room with. His scenes are slower, his investigation is granted more weight, and his eventual confrontation with Nolan carries more menace than the comic was inclined to grant it. The comic uses him as a way to keep the murder mystery alive without burdening any of the major heroes with the investigation. The show uses him as a kind of moral compass with no jurisdiction, a character who can see what no one else can see, and who has no ability to act on it without being told to leave. That tonal change is not large, but it ripples through several scenes in the first season, and it gives Damien a kind of grief about being right that the comic was less interested in pursuing. The voice cast is itself one of the show's largest changes to the comic, and it deserves its own attention. The decision to cast Steven Yeun as Mark Grayson reshapes the entire emotional register of the lead character. The Mark of the comic is, for many years, a wide-eyed teenager who reads on the page with a kind of bright optimism and physical confidence. The Mark of the show carries a slightly different weight. He is uncertain in a way that has more anxiety in it, more humor, more melancholy. Stephen Yeun's voice does not push for heroism. It allows Mark to sound, frequently, like he is improvising his way through a life he was not prepared for, and that performance choice colors every line he reads in the show. Mark sounds tired sometimes. Mark sounds embarrassed sometimes. Mark sounds like a boy talking to his mother sometimes, even when he is in the middle of a fight. The comic version of Mark is closer to a classic four-color hero with feelings. The show version of Mark is a young man on the verge of a breakdown who is trying to be useful in the meantime, and the casting is at the center of that shift. J.K. Simmons as Nolan Grayson is the other piece of the same coin. The Nolan of the comic is a stern, broad-shouldered, somewhat distant father with a strong jaw and a calm voice. The Nolan of the show inherits all of that and adds the precise, controlled menace of an actor who has been playing serious men with damaged moral centers for decades. Simmons does not have to perform villainy to make Nolan terrifying. He has to perform competence, parental love, and patient irritation, and the moment those three things tilt against each other, the audience understands instantly that something is profoundly wrong inside this man. The casting is not a rewriting of Nolan. It is a discovery of him in performance that the comic could only gesture toward. The result is that the Nolan of the show is more frightening because he is more loving. He has a fuller voice, he is more recognizably a man you would trust until you could not, and that performance carries the show through its hardest pivots. Sandra Oh as Debbie Grayson is the third pillar of that casting decision. Debbie of the comic has dialogue that is largely functional. Debbie of the show has the entire weight of a character who must hold together the show's emotional center, and Sandra Oh's performance gives Debbie a particular kind of brittleness, warmth, and slow-burning rage that the comic never had access to in the same way. There are moments in the second season where Debbie does not say very much for long stretches of an episode, and her presence is still the loudest thing on screen. The voice work, the writing, and the way the animation responds to her performance all combine to make Debbie an active participant in every conversation in the show, even when she is the quietest person in the room. The comic was about Mark and Nolan. The show is about Mark, Nolan, and Debbie, and that triangulation is one of the most consequential adaptation choices the writers and producers made. Mark Hamill as Art Rosenbaum is a smaller change with a particular charm. Art, in the comic, is a tailor who designs superhero costumes out of a basement workshop, and he is one of Nolan's oldest friends. He is largely a quiet supporting character who appears whenever a costume needs to be fixed or a piece of advice needs to be given. The show keeps Art exactly as he is, and then casts Mark Hamill in the role, which lends the character a particular kind of warmth and gentle authority that the page could only approximate. Hamill's performance lets Art carry small scenes with substantial weight. When Art apologizes to Mark for hiding Nolan's earlier transgressions from him, the comic version of the scene is touching but contained. The show version, with Hamill's reading of it, is one of the most quietly devastating moments of the first season. The casting choice is the entire reason that change lands. The writing is the same. The performance is what does it. Walton Goggins as Cecil Stedman is part of the same set of decisions. Cecil on the page is a useful function with a strong voice. Cecil on the screen is a southern accented spy master with an internal weariness that the comic never explicitly assigned to him. Goggins finds something inside Cecil that is half political operator, half private man at the end of a long career, and that performance reshapes Cecil from a piece of plot machinery into a character whose ambivalence is the moral spine of an entire half of the show. The change is not in the writing of Cecil exactly. It is in the way Cecil's moral grayscale is voiced, allowed to breathe, and dramatized across episodes. The comic was always going to be reading Cecil through the limits of his page presence. The show takes the same character and gives him a full performance, and that performance is itself an adaptation choice. Gillian Jacobs as Adam Eve, Zachary Quinto as Robot, Jason Mantzoukas as Rex Splode, Carrie Payton as Black Samson, all of these casting decisions are themselves changes to the comic. The comic gives these characters voices on the page that the reader has to invent for themselves. The show gives them specific voices, specific performances, specific tonal registers that shape how their dialogue lands. Rex Splode is a particularly clear example. On the page, he is brash, foul-mouthed, irritating, and eventually surprisingly noble. On the screen, with the voice he has been given, His arc from glib teenager to person willing to sacrifice himself reads with a particular kind of swagger and underlying fragility that the page only gestured at. The change here is not a rewrite of any individual character. It is the cumulative effect of a casting strategy that treats every supporting role as something worth giving a real performance to, rather than as a piece of visual furniture, and that strategy alters the texture of the entire show. D.A. Sinclair and the Reanimen arc is one of the comic stories the show pulls forward considerably and gives more weight to than the page ever did. In the comic, Sinclair is a college student whose unethical experiments on missing persons eventually attract Mark's attention and trigger a confrontation. The arc is contained, ugly, and over relatively quickly. The show takes the same character and expands his presence considerably. It also threads his work into the larger ecosystem of villainy on the planet, making him not just a lone scientist with a basement, but a node in a network that includes the Maulers, Sinclair's own customers, and eventually the Global Defense Agency itself, which becomes interested in Reanimen as a tool. The shift is partly a matter of pacing, partly a matter of theme. The comic version of Sinclair is a single horror story. The show version of him is one piece of a longer argument about who is allowed to do what to whose body in the name of progress, and that argument runs through Cecil, through Donald, through Rudy, through Mark himself, and through the show's eventual interest in what counts as a person. The Reanimen become a kind of motif in the show that they were not on the page, and that gives Sinclair a slightly larger role inside the larger structure of the story. Rick Sheridan, who in the comic is a relatively minor figure, best known for being one of Sinclair's victims and a brief love interest for William, gets a different and more sustained arc in the show. The comic uses Rick primarily as a way to introduce William's romantic life and to show the consequences of Sinclair's work on a character we have come to care about. The show does the same, but with considerably more screen time, more interior moments, and more weight given to Rick's struggle to live in a body that has been altered against his consent. The decision to slow down on Rick is part of the same impulse that drives the show's treatment of Donald. The writers are interested in what it feels like to be a person whose body and mind have been altered for someone else's purposes, and Rick becomes one of the show's clearest dramatizations of that question. The comic's brisker pace did not give him the same room to suffer. The show, with longer episodes and more time between fights, lets Rick stand at the center of an entire emotional argument for stretches at a time, and his presence reshapes William's arc in turn. William Clockwell himself is also softly expanded in the show in ways that are easy to miss. The comic gives William a clear function as Mark's best friend, a personality, a sexuality, and a real role in the story, and the show keeps all of that. What it adds is a kind of secondary structure of college life, post-college life, and adult relationships that the comic moves through more briskly. William has a longer arc with Rick. William has more friendships. William is allowed to be more present in the back half of the show than the comic was inclined to make him, and that change makes the eventual emotional weight of his choices a little heavier. The show does not turn William into a different person. It simply gives him more time on screen and trusts him to use it, and most of the moments where William carries a scene by himself feel like adaptations rather than inventions, because they are taking something the comic gestured at and giving it room to land. Titan, the underground anti-hero who in the comic is a hard-edged criminal with a moral conscience and a complicated home life, is introduced in the show with a particular focus on the family he is trying to protect. The comic gives Titan an arc that takes him from low-level enforcer to local power broker to someone trying to do good with the resources he has stolen. The show keeps that trajectory and condenses it. It makes his domestic life more prominent earlier. It makes his quiet menace more visible. It makes his eventual confrontation with Machine Head and his takeover of the criminal underbelly of the city more clearly motivated by what he is trying to give to his daughter and his wife. The change is not enormous, but it is consistent with the rest of the show's pattern. Wherever the comic gave a character a clear arc, the show found a way to give that character a more present family, a more visible home, and a clearer interior reason for the choices they were going to make. Titan is one of the cleanest examples of that pattern because his comic arc was already grounded in personal stakes, and the show simply lets those stakes occupy more screen time. Machine Head, in the comic, is a slick villain with a network of operatives and a particular fondness for technology. The show keeps the basic shape and gives him slightly more personality. The performance, the design, the way he moves through scenes, all of that gives Machine Head a louder presence in the show than he had on the page. He is also positioned more clearly as the kind of long-term planner whose ambitions stretch beyond the city. The comic version of him is essentially a regional crime lord with delusions of grandeur. The show version of him is a regional crime lord with delusions of grandeur and a writer's room interested in dramatizing those delusions. The shift is small, but it gives the early conflicts with Titan and the Reanimen a slightly more operatic shape than the comic version of those same conflicts ever had. The Flaxen invasion, one of the comic's most memorable interdimensional plots, is handled in the show with substantially condensed pacing and a slightly different visual style. In the comic, the Flaxens attack Earth, retreat into their dimension where time moves differently, and return later as a much more advanced civilization seeking revenge. The show keeps that exact structure, but compresses the arc considerably, partly for episode economy, and partly because the show needs to keep moving forward toward larger conflicts. The visual presentation of the Flaxens is largely faithful, but the show stages their attacks with a sharper sense of horror, particularly in the scenes where their advanced fleet reappears, and the heroes have to scramble. The comic treated the Flaxen arc as a self-contained adventure with consequences. The show treats it as a kind of practice run for the larger interstellar conflicts the audience will eventually face, and that reframing is itself a subtle change. Battle Beast is one of the comic's most beloved single-character introductions, a hulking warrior who arrives on Earth looking for an opponent who can give him the death he wants. The show keeps almost everything about Battle Beast, and tweaks the tone of his introduction in a few specific ways. The fight in which he is introduced is more brutal in the show than it is in the comic, partly because the animation can sustain a longer sequence, and partly because the writers want the audience to understand exactly how outclassed the Guardians are when they encounter him. The comic version of the fight is shocking. The show version is sustained and exhausting. The voice performance also gives Battle Beast a particular kind of weary dignity that the comic indicated but did not perform. He is, in both versions, a warrior looking for a meaningful end, but the show emphasizes the meaning more than the end. That difference matters when the character returns later. The show's Battle Beast has been carrying a sadness that the comic version mostly externalized. The shift is subtle, but it shows up in every scene he appears in. The college transition for Mark, his move out of high school and into upstate university, is handled with a slightly different timeline in the show. The comic moves Mark through high school graduation and into college with a particular forward momentum, and most of the relationships he forms in college become major fixtures of the rest of the run. The show makes the same transition, but compresses some of the milestones, expands some of the supporting cast, and shifts the timing of Mark's relationship with Amber substantially. The college setting becomes less of a fixed backdrop in the show than it is in the comic. Mark is often called away from class, called away from his dorm, called away from his friends, and the show is interested in dramatizing that pull more than the comic was inclined to be. The change is largely a matter of emphasis. The show keeps the college years intact, but it leans more heavily on the emotional cost of Mark's divided life, and the dorm rooms and campus walks become a kind of recurring image that contrasts with the spectacle of his hero work. The comic was content to use college as a setting. The show uses college as a kind of running argument about the life Mark is failing to live. Anissa, the Viltrumite officer who attacks Mark in one of the most controversial sequences of the entire run, is handled in the show with a great deal of care and a slightly different framing than the comic. In the comic, the scene is presented with a brutality and a graphic detail that drew enormous criticism at the time of its publication, and the storytelling around it has been a subject of ongoing debate among readers for years. The show retains the broad shape of the scene, including the violence and the violation, and the aftermath in which Mark has to live with what was done to him, but it makes a number of presentation choices that change how the scene reads on screen. The show leans into Mark's horror and helplessness rather than into spectacle. It frames Anissa with more menace and less swagger than the comic version did. It treats the consequences of the assault as ongoing rather than resolved, and it allows Mark's later interactions with the people he loves to carry the weight of what happened to him. The change is not a softening of the source material. If anything, the show's framing is harder to watch in some ways, because it refuses to let the camera move past what is happening in the way the panel layout of a comic page can sometimes inadvertently do. The show treats the moment as something that should not be looked away from, and it treats the aftermath as a wound the story will carry for the rest of its run. That is a different kind of choice than the comic made, and it is one of the more visible structural changes in how the show treats sexual violence as a subject. The Thraxen arc, in which Nolan flees to a distant planet, falls in love with a local woman named Andressa, and fathers a child who is Mark's half-brother, is brought forward in the show with a slightly different tempo than the comic. In the comic, this storyline emerges over many issues and gives the reader a lot of time to sit with the strangeness of Nolan's new life, his apparent contentment, and the difficulty Mark has accepting any of it. The show keeps the basic plot beats intact, but folds them into a tighter structure. Andressa is given a clearer voice. Oliver, the half-brother, is introduced with more emotional weight. Nolan's apparent transformation from murderous patriarch to gentle alien stepfather is presented with the same suspicion the comic invited, but the show makes that suspicion harder for the audience to feel comfortable with, because we have spent more screen time with the Mark, who is being asked to forgive his father. The reframing reshapes the moral weight of the arc. The comic asks whether a man like Nolan can change. The show asks the same question but lingers more on the cost of asking it at all, and that lingering becomes one of the most interesting differences in how the two media handle this stretch of the story. Oliver, Mark's half-brother, is also handled with more emotional groundwork in the show than the comic had time for. In the comic, Oliver is a curious and rapidly maturing alien child whose accelerated growth becomes a kind of dark joke about how quickly he goes from infant to fighter. The show keeps the accelerated growth as a plot mechanic, but treats it as a more disturbing problem than the comic did. Mark has to be a brother to a child who is not really a child for very long. Debbie has to be a mother to a boy who is not technically hers. The Thraxans have to be a culture whose customs the audience has to learn alongside the Graysons. All of that takes more screen time in the show than the comic spent on it, and all of it gives Oliver a more grounded sense of personhood than the comic version had at the same point in the story. The shift is partly a matter of pacing, and partly a matter of investment. The show wants the audience to love Oliver, because the show is going to ask the audience to fear for him later, and that earlier emotional groundwork is exactly the kind of change adaptation often makes. Angstrom Levy is one of the show's most heavily adapted villains, and his arc has been restructured in ways that diverge significantly from the comic at several points. In the comic, Angstrom is a scientist whose interdimensional experiments leave him scarred, multi-minded, and obsessed with destroying Mark Grayson. His arc is ugly, sustained, and culminates in some of the comic's bleakest moments. The show keeps Angstrom's basic premise, his interdimensional access, his deformation, his pathological focus on Mark, and then it threads him through the back half of the second season and into the third season as a recurring rather than self-contained threat. The interdimensional travel becomes a more frequent visual device in the show. The variant Marks the show explores are folded into Angstrom's arc with more thematic weight than the comic gave them. His confrontation with Mark in the apartment of Mark's mother-in-law, a sequence that has been the subject of intense fan discussion since the comic first published it, is restaged in the show with a slightly different framing that gives Mark a more visible loss of control and gives Angstrom a more visible look of having pushed too far. The change is in the framing and in the consequences, not in the basic event. The show makes Angstrom into a more sustained nightmare than the comic ever did, and his repeated returns reshape what the audience expects from a multiverse plot. That is a significant adaptation choice with consequences for everything that follows. The variant Marks the show introduces deserve their own attention. In the comic, the idea of alternative versions of Mark, of futures he might have become, is dealt with in a few specific arcs and largely contained. The show has been more interested in this idea from earlier on, leveraging the animation medium to introduce variant Marks who serve as visual and thematic warnings to the Mark we are following. Some of these variants are clearly drawn from the comic. Some are clearly invented, the use of them as a kind of recurring chorus, a way of telling the audience what Mark could become if he keeps making particular choices, is more elaborate in the show than it is on the page. The choice is partly a function of the medium. Animation can deliver a variant Mark in seconds, and the show takes advantage of that. The comic has to draw, ink, color, and letter every version of a character it introduces, and so it is more economical with its alternates. The show is more generous, and the generosity becomes one of its most striking adaptation choices. The structure of Conquest introduction is one of the most discussed adaptation decisions in the back half of the show's run. In the comic, Conquest is one of the most terrifying single antagonists Mark ever faces, a Viltrumite warrior whose appearance is brutal, sustained, and life-altering. The show holds Conquest back for longer than the comic did, allowing the audience to anticipate him through years of indirect references, glimpses, and warnings before he finally arrives. When he does arrive, his role is partially reshaped to fit the larger structural needs of the show. The fight itself remains brutal, and the consequences remain enormous, but the order in which Conquest appears and what surrounds his presence has been adjusted to align with the show's overall arc, rather than the comic's serialized structure. The change is not a softening. If anything, the delayed arrival makes Conquest's eventual presence feel even more loaded than it did on the page. The audience knows what Viltrumites are capable of by the time he arrives. The audience knows what kind of damage he can do. And so when he finally steps onto the screen, the show is leveraging not just his comic legacy but every Viltrumite encounter that has come before him in the show. The Viltrumite Empire itself is presented with substantially more political detail in the show than the comic ever bothered to provide. The comic introduces the Viltrumites primarily through Nolan, then through other warriors, and then through Thrag, with the political structure of their society remaining largely implied through behavior and through Nolan's monologues. The show is more interested in giving the audience a clearer sense of how Viltrum is organized, how it makes decisions, how its warriors are deployed, and what its relationship with the larger galactic community looks like. This expansion is partly the work of the show's interest in interstellar politics generally, and partly a necessary consequence of having to dramatize long-term plot developments that the comic could handle through expository dialogue. The Viltrumites of the show speak more often, in more contexts, and to more characters than they do on the page. They have private moments. They have arguments with each other. They have ideological disagreements about what their conquest is for. None of that is foreign to the comic, but the show makes it visible in a way that the comic was rarely interested in doing, and that visibility reshapes the audience's understanding of what Viltrum actually represents as an antagonist. Thrag, the eventual final ruler and ideological center of Viltrum's worst impulses, has been mentioned and gestured at in the show with growing frequency as the seasons have progressed, and the show's pacing around him is structured very differently from the comic. In the comic, Thrag emerges as a major figure relatively late in the run, and his arc with Mark is one of the longest and most consequential storylines in the entire series. The show, knowing it has a limited number of episodes and a need to build up to its largest confrontations, has been seeding Thrag with patience rather than introducing him quickly. That choice means the show will eventually have to deliver on years of accumulated anticipation, and the delivery will probably look different from the comic version of the same arc. The audience will have to be ready for him in a way that comic readers were not necessarily, because comic readers had years of monthly issues to gradually escalate to him. The show's compressed timeline means that when Thrag finally takes the stage as a central antagonist, his presence will be felt against the backdrop of every other Viltrumite the audience has already met, rather than as a slow escalation from earlier antagonists. Anissa's introduction is itself slightly restructured in the show, with the audience meeting her in a context that emphasizes her role as a Viltrumite enforcer earlier than the comic did. The comic introduces Anissa in a relatively contained context, and gradually expands her role over many issues. The show makes her presence felt more centrally from the moment she appears, in part because the show needs to convey the wider Viltrumite threat in a compressed timeline. The change is one of emphasis rather than substance. Anissa is recognizably the same character. She simply has more screen time and more obvious centrality earlier in her arc, and that earlier centrality reshapes how the audience reads her every appearance. The Viltrumite warriors who arrive on Earth and Thraxa in one of the show's most spectacular fights, including Lucan and Thula from the comic, and Vidor, who was created for the show as far as fans have pieced together, are largely faithful to the comic, but are given more distinct personalities than the page versions had time to develop. The comic uses comparable Viltrumites primarily as obstacles, formidable opponents to be defeated in sequence, while the show takes the opportunity to give each of them a slightly different visual identity and a slightly different rhythm of speech. The change is small but consequential. By giving the Viltrumites individuality, the show makes them frightening as people rather than as a uniform threat, and that individual frightfulness reshapes how the audience reads the Viltrumite Empire generally. The comic version of these obstacle warriors is functional. The show's trio is 3 different kinds of menace, and each of them carries a slightly different weight. The early Viltrumite who confronts Nolan to remind him of his mission, the warrior whose name and appearance briefly disrupts the Grayson family dinner, is presented in the show with slightly more menace and a slightly more economical scene structure than the comic version. The comic uses these early Viltrumite interactions as a way to build tension between Nolan and his secret responsibilities. The show keeps that purpose entirely intact while compressing the dialogue and making the visual presentation more cinematic. The pattern is small but recurring. Wherever the comic gave a Viltrumite a long page of expository dialogue, the show gives them a shorter scene with more visual weight, and the cumulative effect is that the Viltrumites in the show feel more frightening because their menace arrives in fewer beats. Powerplex, who in the comic is one of Mark's most personally tragic antagonists, has been seated in the show with a particular kind of long-term patience that differs from the comic's pacing. In the comic, Powerplex is introduced and quickly tied to the consequences of Mark's earlier battles, specifically the loss of life caused by the larger Invincible war sequence. His vendetta against Mark is direct, brutal, and one of the comic's most morally complex confrontations. The show has been building Powerplex through earlier glimpses and references, particularly through scenes that establish him as someone whose loss has been caused by Mark's actions, even when Mark could not have known. The eventual confrontation between them, when the show stages it, will land differently than the comics version, because the show will have given the audience more time with Powerplex as a figure of grief, rather than as a sudden antagonist. The change is one of preparation, and it positions Powerplex to function as a character study as much as an obstacle. Monster Girl is one of the supporting characters whose interior life the show expands with particular thoughtfulness. The comic gives her a backstory involving a curse, a body that ages backwards each time she transforms, and a long, complicated history with her own appearance. The show keeps every element of that backstory and dramatizes it with considerably more attention to the lived experience of being trapped in a body that does not match her age or her wishes. Her relationship with Robot, in particular, is given more weight in the show than it was on the page, and the transformations she goes through during their shared work in the Flaxen dimension are treated with a particular kind of horror that the comic was less interested in foregrounding. The expansion makes Monster Girl one of the show's most quietly heartbreaking supporting characters, and her presence in the back half of the second season is part of what gives that stretch of the show its particular tonal weight. The comic was always sympathetic to her. The show is sympathetic and unwilling to look away. Black Samson, the longtime hero whose powers come from a piece of technology rather than from any innate ability, is given a clearer through line in the show than the comic provided. In the comic, Black Samson is a former Guardian whose return to active duty becomes part of the larger story of who can step up after the original Guardians are killed. The show keeps the general arc but expands the personal stakes. He is allowed to have more interior moments. He is allowed to have more visible doubts. His leadership of the reformed Guardians is dramatized with more attention to the politics of who agrees to follow whom and why. The shift does not invent anything that the comic does not at least gesture at, but it gives the character a clearer presence on screen, and that clarity helps the show convey a sense of the Guardians as a real working team, rather than a roster of names. Rexplode's arc is one of the most carefully reshaped supporting character journeys in the show. The comic version of Rex is a glib, foul-mouthed, sometimes obnoxious teenager who eventually develops into a hero worth caring about, and his eventual sacrifice in one of the comic's largest battles is one of the most affecting moments of the entire run. The show keeps the basic shape of his arc, including his irritating swagger, his friendship with Mark, his complicated romantic history with Eve, and his late-game emergence as a man of real moral weight. What the show changes is the rhythm of his development. He grows up over a shorter span of episodes, his maturity arrives more visibly, and his relationship with Eve is given more attention than the comic ever quite paid it. The result is that when his moment of sacrifice arrives in the show's continuation of the story, the audience has spent more time inside the head of a Rex, who has been quietly trying to become a better person, and the loss lands with a slightly different shape than the comics version did. Dupli-Kate is another character whose interior life the show expands without rewriting her basic role. In the comic, Kate is a member of the teen team, a love interest for the Immortal, and a recurring presence in the larger superhero community. Her arc, particularly around her relationship with the Immortal and her own family connections, is one the comic developed over many issues. The show keeps those threads intact and tightens the timeline. Kate's bond with the Immortal feels more central earlier. Her sister Multi-Paul is given more visible presence. Her own internal logic about what kind of life she wants and what kind of relationship she is willing to commit to is dramatized with more care. The change is modest, but it reshapes her into a fuller character on screen than she ever quite was on the page. Shrinking Ray, who in the comic is a relatively minor supporting hero with a clear personality and a sad fate, is given more screen time in the show than the comic provided. The show treats her as part of the working Guardians lineup with more weight, and her interactions with Black Samson, with Monster Girl, and with the larger team are given more color. The expansion is small but consistent with the show's general pattern of giving every Guardian a slightly more developed presence than the comic version had at the same point in the story. Bulletproof, who eventually inherits a particular legacy that the show has been carefully building toward, has been seated in the show with even more attention than the comic gave him at his earliest appearances. The comic introduces Bulletproof as a relatively standard new hero, whose story develops over time. The show gives him more presence in the supporting cast, more visible motivation, and more space to become a real character before his eventual elevation to a larger role. The change is a function of long-term planning. The show knows where it wants to go with Bulletproof, and is willing to invest in him early enough that the eventual development of his arc will feel earned. The choice to give the show an opening title sequence that recolors itself over the course of the first season is one of the cleverest visual adaptation decisions the production team made. The opening credits begin clean and stylized and accumulate blood spatter through the season, until by the final episode the title sequence is essentially soaked in red. The comic, of course, has no opening credits, no recurring visual theme that develops across episodes, no equivalent device for telling the audience that the world they are watching is going to get worse. The show invented this device as a way of communicating, in seconds and without dialogue, what the season is doing emotionally. It is a small structural addition, but it is one of the most distinctive things about the show as a piece of television, and it has no comic equivalent because the comic had no need for one. The show's choice to release seasons in split halves with mid-season breaks is itself an adaptation decision, even though it is technically a release strategy rather than a narrative one. The comic ran on a monthly schedule and could pace its arcs across years. The show has had to find ways to structure its 8-episode seasons so that each half feels like a satisfying unit while still building toward the larger arc of the season. The mid-season breaks have shaped where the show puts its biggest moments, where it ends its halves, and what it expects the audience to sit with during the months between airings. The cliffhangers the show has built into its mid-season breaks have no exact comic equivalent, because the comic could publish the next issue 30 days later. The show, knowing its audience would be sitting with whatever it left them at the break for considerably longer, has placed some of its most emotionally heavy moments at exactly those points. That is itself an adaptation choice with substantial consequences. The Invincible War, one of the comic's largest and most apocalyptic set pieces, is restructured in the show with a particular kind of compression that gives the event a different shape than its source. In the comic, a wave of alternate marks from across the multiverse attacks Earth simultaneously, decimating the population and overwhelming every hero on the planet. The show has been moving toward this idea through the multiverse plotting around Angstrom Levy, and when it finally stages a comparable event, the structural shape is different from the comic version. The show is more interested in the personal cost of the event than in the scale of the destruction, and the framing emphasizes the individual variant marks rather than the collective wave. That reframing reshapes how the audience reads the consequences. The comic's Invincible War is partly a horror about scale. The show's version of comparable events is partly a horror about identity. Both are honest readings of the material. They are simply different emphases. The death of Nolan Grayson is one of the comic's most patient long-term arcs, with the character's eventual fate functioning as both a redemption and a tragedy. The show has been moving toward this development through its handling of Nolan across multiple seasons, but the specific timing and circumstance of where the show eventually arrives may differ in significant ways from the comic. Any speculation about exactly how the show handles Nolan's eventual end would be exactly that, speculation, and the show has reserved the right to depart from the comic in significant ways whenever it has felt that a different ending would serve the story better. What we know for certain is that the show has been building Nolan into a more emotionally complex character than the comic version was at the same point in his arc, and that complexity is likely to color whatever ending the show eventually gives him. The animation style of the show is the most fundamental change the production made from the comic, even though it might not feel like one at first. The comic is drawn with a particular flat, clean line and a coloring style that emphasizes bold, flat fields of color. The show inherits the basic visual vocabulary, the body shapes, the costume designs, the general iconography, and then translates it into a moving image medium that has to make different choices about lighting, motion, and depth. The result is a show that looks like the comic in still frames, but moves differently than any comic page can move. The way characters fly, the way they fight, the way they land, all of that has to be invented for animation. The show's particular fluid motion, its choice to render impact with a kind of visceral weight, its decision to dwell on the consequences of violence for a beat longer than the comic page would, all of that is the work of an animation team translating a comic into a different medium. The comic gives the show its bones, the animation gives the show its body, and that body is part of the adaptation, not separate from it. The show's depiction of blood and physical consequence is, paradoxically, one of the most faithful and one of the most changed elements of the adaptation. The comic is famously bloody. It earned a reputation for being one of the most graphically violent mainstream superhero books of its era, and many readers came to it expecting the gore as part of the experience. The show keeps that level of violence intact, sometimes increases it, and stages it with a kind of clinical, sustained attention that the comic was sometimes too economical to give. The comic shows you the impact. The show shows you the impact and then holds on the body for an extra beat. The comic shows you the blood, the show shows you the blood, and the way it pools, the way it dries, the way it stays on a character's costume into the next scene. The difference is largely a matter of duration. The visual elements are the same. The amount of time the audience is asked to spend with them is longer. That decision has the effect of making the violence feel both more honest and more difficult to look at, and it is one of the key reasons the show has been received as more emotionally heavy than the comic in many places, even when the events being depicted are identical. The first season finale, the Chicago fight between Mark and Nolan, is arguably the most expanded single sequence in the entire adaptation. In the comic, the confrontation is brutal and decisive, but it is staged across a relatively contained number of pages and is told with a particular efficiency. The show stretches the fight across a much longer sequence, takes the action through different parts of the city, dwells on the specific consequences for individual bystanders, and gives Nolan and Mark a sustained verbal exchange in the middle of it that is dramatized with more attention to facial expression and silence than the page version had. The comic gives you the famous father-son monologue in panels. The show gives you the same monologue across rooftops, inside collapsed buildings, against the sound of a city dying. The shift is largely a matter of staging, but it is also a matter of emphasis. The show is more interested in the cost of Nolan's argument than in the argument itself, and so the camera lingers on what is happening to the world around them while they are talking. The result is one of the most discussed sequences in modern superhero animation, and it owes much of its power to the show's decision to give the scene room to breathe. The flashbacks to Nolan's earlier life on Viltrum, his arrival on Earth, and the long years of his quiet preparation for his eventual betrayal are presented in the show with more visual detail and more emotional weight than the comic afforded them. The comic establishes Nolan's history through dialogue and through a handful of flashback sequences. The show takes those moments and stages them as full scenes, sometimes spanning multiple episodes, showing Nolan as a younger man, showing him meeting Debbie, showing him making the choices that would eventually lead to the moment in the windowless room. The expansion is a function of what television can do that comics cannot easily do, which is to use a different visual register for the past and to let the past sit alongside the present without expository labeling. The result is that the show's Nolan has a more visible history than the comic's Nolan does, and that visible history reshapes everything the audience feels about him. Mark's costume, in the comic, evolves over time through a series of changes that reflect his developing identity. The show has been adapting those changes with some flexibility, sometimes keeping a particular look longer than the comic did, and sometimes accelerating a change to coincide with a particular moment of growth. The blue and yellow costume of Mark's earliest career is largely faithful to the comic, but the show has been careful about when exactly he transitions to other looks, choosing the moments that will carry the most emotional weight, rather than the moments that line up with the comic's pacing. The change is small but consistent. The show treats Mark's costume as part of his characterization, and it puts costume changes where they will land hardest, rather than where the comic happened to put them. The Adam Eve who ends up using her abilities to feed people in developing countries is presented in the show with more direct dramatic weight than the comic gave that subplot. In the comic, Eve eventually leaves the teen team and tries to use her powers for direct humanitarian purposes, and the failure of that effort, the way the world around her resists being helped, is one of the comic's most quietly devastating arcs. The show keeps the same general direction and gives the audience more time inside Eve's perspective during these efforts. The frustrations she encounters, the political resistance to her interventions, the personal cost of trying to help and failing, all of that is given more screen time and more interior monologue than the comic was inclined to provide. The expansion makes Eve's eventual return to more conventional hero work feel like a defeat rather than a choice, and it deepens her position within the larger ethical arguments the show is interested in making about what superpowers can and cannot do. The Sequids, the parasitic hive mind aliens who become a central threat in one of the comic's later arcs, have been introduced earlier in the show than they were on the page, and their threat has been seated with more visible weight. In the comic, the Sequids emerge as a Mars-based menace whose involvement with Mark unfolds over several arcs. The show has been positioning them with patience, giving the audience glimpses of Mars and of the Sequid presence there in episodes that otherwise focus on other plots. By the time the Sequids fully emerge as a major threat, the audience will have been carrying their existence for longer than the comic version of the same arc allowed, and that carrying changes the eventual landing of the storyline. Russ Livingston, the astronaut who in the comic becomes the human vector for the Sequid presence on Mars, is given more screen time and more interior weight in the show than the comic provided. The comic uses Russ primarily as a plot device, a way to bring the Sequids into closer human contact. The show treats him as a character whose ordeal deserves attention, and his scenes carry more weight than the page version of the same character had at the same point. The shift is small but consistent with the show's general pattern of insisting on the personhood of the people the comic was content to use as functions. The Martians themselves, the green-skinned hostile residents of Mars who feature prominently in the comic's Mars arc, are given a slightly different visual presentation in the show, with more attention to their political organization and their particular fear of the Sequids. The comic treats the Martians largely as a comic relief antagonist, hostile to Mark, and easily dispatched in a humorous way. The show keeps the humor, but adds more menace, giving the Martians a clearer sense of being a culture, with real internal logic, and real fears about the parasites that would overwhelm them if given the chance. The change is one of texture, and it makes the Mars arc feel like a more serious geopolitical situation than the comic generally treated it as. Ragnar, the underwater being who in the comic becomes briefly significant as an antagonist tied to Aquarus' eventual replacement on the throne of Atlantis, is given more visual presence in the show, although the larger Atlantean storyline has been compressed considerably. The comic's Atlantis storyline involves Mark accidentally becoming engaged to an Atlantean princess after defeating Aquarus' killer in a duel, a sequence that is famously absurd and famously fan-beloved. The show has handled this storyline with a particular kind of dark humor and with a tonal awareness of how easily it could come across as exploitative if presented straight. The change is largely a matter of comic timing and presentation, rather than substance, but it shows how attentively the production has thought about which elements of the comic translate cleanly and which ones need to be handled with care. The Lizard League, one of the comic's recurring lower-tier villain groups, makes brief appearances in the show with slightly more menace than they had on the page. The comic uses the Lizard League primarily for comic relief and to give Mark some easy victories early in his career. The show keeps the same general purpose but makes the Lizard League slightly more dangerous, slightly more competent, and slightly more memorable as individual antagonists. The shift is small but consistent with the show's tendency to take the comic's lower-stakes encounters more seriously than the source did. Komodo Dragon, the reptilian heavy hitter of the Lizard League, is given a slightly more imposing physical presence in the show, although his role remains essentially that of a recurring obstacle for early career Mark. The change is more visual than narrative, and it is part of the broader pattern of the show, treating the comic's villain roster with a kind of attention that elevates even the throwaway antagonists into figures the audience can recognize. Doc Seismic, who in the comic is a relatively minor recurring antagonist tied to seismic activity, gets a clearer presentation in the show and a slightly more theatrical personality. The change is again small, primarily a function of casting and performance, but it gives Doc Seismic a more memorable presence than the comic version had at the same point. The show treats him as part of a recurring rotation of villains whose return episodes can carry weight, while the comic was content to use him sparingly. The Kill Cannon, a power-suited villain who appears in both the comic and the show, is given a slightly more developed background and slightly more screen presence in the show. The shift is consistent with the show's general approach to its lower-tier antagonist roster, which is to treat every villain as someone worth giving a small but specific performance to, rather than as background color. The cumulative effect of these small changes is that the show's villain ecosystem feels more populated than the comics, even when most of the same characters are present. Cecil Stedman's underground bunker complex, the secret subterranean facility from which he runs much of his agency's most sensitive operations, is given far more visual texture in the show than the comic ever provided. The comic uses the bunker primarily as a backdrop for important conversations. The show makes the bunker a recurring character of its own, with specific rooms, specific corridors, specific recurring imagery of Cecil walking through the same spaces in different emotional states. The expansion is largely a function of the show's interest in giving its locations real personhood, and the bunker becomes one of the most recognizable visual environments in the entire series. The Reanimen, the cyborg foot soldiers Sinclair builds and Cecil eventually adopts, are given more screen presence in the show than the comic gave them, with multiple recurring deployments and a clearer sense of their tactical role within Cecil's larger arsenal. That foregrounding is part of the show's interest in dramatizing the morally compromised utility of human bodies turned into weapons, and the recurring presence of the Reanimen in Cecil's operations becomes part of what makes Cecil's later decisions feel weighted with accumulated wrongs. When the show introduces new heroes to fill out the Guardians lineup, including characters who do not have direct comic equivalents, the introductions are themselves a structural adaptation choice. The comic's Guardians of the Globe roster evolves over time, but the show has the freedom to introduce new members with slightly different powers, slightly different personalities, and slightly different roles in the team's larger function. Whenever the show introduces a hero who does not appear in the comic, the introduction is itself a change worth noting, and it is generally a sign that the writers wanted to fill a specific narrative or visual gap that the comic's roster did not quite cover. Mark's college roommate Rick is treated as one of the smaller character changes the show makes, with the relationship between Mark and Rick given slightly more weight than the comic gave it. The comic uses Rick primarily as a way to introduce William and to set up the Sinclair encounter. The show treats Rick as a person Mark has actually befriended, with shared moments, conversations, and a quiet camaraderie that gives his eventual transformation by Sinclair more emotional weight. The change is small but consistent with the show's general approach to the supporting cast. Eve's parents are given slightly more direct screen time and slightly more interior monologue in the show than the comic provided. The comic gives Eve's father a particular kind of bitterness about her abilities, and the show keeps that exact bitterness but dramatizes it with more direct attention. The father's anger, the mother's quieter complicity, the family dinner sequences, all of that is given more visible texture in the show, and it makes Eve's eventual departure from her family of origin feel like a more sustained decision than the comic version implied. Mark's grandparents and his extended family, who in the comic appear only occasionally, are given slightly more screen presence in the show, particularly as Debbie's support network during the long aftermath of Nolan's betrayal. The change is small but consistent. The comic was content to imply Mark's larger family. The show insists on showing parts of it, and that insistence gives the Grayson family a clearer sense of being part of a community rather than existing in isolation. The show's handling of pregnancy, particularly Aquarus's wife's pregnancy in the first season, and other pregnancies that surface across the comic's longer run, has been adjusted to fit the show's particular emotional emphases. The comic uses pregnancies as plot beats with specific narrative purposes. The show treats them with more attention to the lived experience of the people involved, and in particular it treats the consequences of Aquarus's death for his pregnant wife with a kind of sustained grief that the comic was less inclined to dwell on. The handling of death generally in the show is one of the most consistent and most consequential changes from the comic. The comic is famously willing to kill characters, often suddenly, often brutally, and often without the kind of extended mourning that other superhero books provide. The show keeps that willingness intact, but adds, in many cases, additional time for the characters who survive to react. The funerals, the conversations with the bereaved, the small everyday moments where someone notices that another person is not in the room, all of that is given more attention in the show than the comic generally provided. The cumulative effect is that the show's deaths feel heavier than the comic's deaths, not because the deaths themselves are different, but because the show insists on showing what happens afterwards. The music and score of the show are themselves one of the largest invisible changes from the comic. The comic, of course, has no music at all. It has lettering, it has sound effect words, and it has the rhythm of panels. The show inherits a soundtrack that is the work of composers given freedom to shape the emotional landscape of each scene, and the music does considerable adaptation work that no panel layout could do. The choice of needle drops, including the use of specific songs at moments of particular violence or tenderness, is itself a structural change. The comic uses silence on the page. The show uses silence between musical cues, which is a different kind of silence entirely. The accumulated effect of these choices is that the show's emotional rhythm differs from the comics in ways that are hard to notice if you have only seen the show, but become obvious the moment you go back to the page. The comic asks the reader to set the tempo. The show sets it for you, and that change colors every scene the show stages. The choice to use particular pop songs at moments of high emotional or violent intensity is one of the show's most discussed stylistic decisions. The comic has no equivalent device. There is no melody running through the panels of the comic's most brutal sequences, and so the comic's brutality lands without the cushion or counterpoint that a song can provide. The show, by laying a contemporary song under a sequence of violent action, does something the page version of the same sequence cannot do. It contextualizes the violence as part of a larger cultural experience. It frames the brutality with irony, or with grief, or with strange beauty, depending on the song. The choice is not one of plot or character, but it is a fundamental shift in how the audience experiences the material, and it is the work of an adaptation team thinking carefully about how to translate emotional weight from one medium into another. Silence in the show, particularly in scenes immediately following a death or a major revelation, is its own carefully constructed change. The comic, having no soundtrack, uses panel composition and white space to convey the same effect. The show, having a soundtrack, has to make explicit decisions about when to drop the music out entirely. Those decisions are visible in nearly every major emotional beat of the series. After certain killings, the music cuts, and the camera lingers on the survivors, in a silence that the comic version of the same scene could only imply through panel layout. After certain confessions, the conversation continues without underscore, allowing the actors' performances to carry the weight without any musical support. These decisions are easy to miss because they feel natural, but each one is an adaptation choice with no direct comic equivalent. The famous fight in Chicago, the season 1 finale, contains one of the show's most heavily discussed pieces of dialogue, a confrontation in which Nolan asks Mark a series of pointed questions about the nature of human life and Mark's place within it. The comic contains the same exchange. The two versions of the conversation are essentially identical in content. What differs is the performance, the staging, and the way the show's framing of the surrounding violence makes Mark's eventual response feel like a young man trying to hold on to an argument against an enormous moral weight. The famous moment, the line that has been quoted, remixed, and turned into reaction images across the internet, lands in the show with a particular intonation that the page could not have provided. The shift is one of medium translation rather than of script. The comic gave the show the words. The show gave the words a voice, and that voice has carried the line into a kind of cultural recognition that the page version, beloved as it is among readers, never quite achieved. The aftermath of that fight, the long stretch of time in which Mark is recovering physically and emotionally from what his father did to him and what his father said to him, is given more screen time in the show than the comic version. The comic moves Mark through his recovery with a certain economy. The show lingers. We see Mark in physical therapy. We see Mark in conversations with his mother that the page version of the same period never had room for. We see Mark trying to return to a normal college life that no longer fits the person he has become. The extension is one of duration, and it gives the audience time to sit with the consequences of an event that the comic was more willing to use as a pivot point. The second season's structural choice to open with a quieter, slower, more interior set of episodes, rather than immediately escalating to the next major confrontation, is itself a significant adaptation decision. The comic, after the Chicago fight, has the freedom to move through the next major plot beats at its own pace. The show, knowing it had a limited number of episodes per year, chose to spend its early second season on character work that the comic moved through more quickly. The audience sits with Debbie's grief. The audience sits with Mark's college life. The audience sits with the early seeding of plots that will not pay off until much later in the season or the next season. The pacing choice gives the show a particular kind of slow burn texture that the comic, with its monthly serial structure, never quite had access to. The introduction of Angstrom Levy in the show is one of the most heavily reframed character arcs, with the character given more recognizable malevolence earlier than the comic provided. In the comic, Angstrom appears as a relatively well-intentioned scientist whose experiments go horribly wrong, and his subsequent transformation into a vengeful antagonist is one of the most disturbing arcs in the series. The show keeps the same general trajectory and gives Angstrom slightly more visible warning signs from his earliest appearance. His ambition, his intensity, the way he treats Mark with a particular kind of demanding politeness, all of that primes the audience for the eventual revelation of what he becomes. The shift is largely one of foreshadowing, and it makes the audience's eventual horror at what Angstrom does feel both more anticipated and more thoroughly earned. The famous confrontation in the apartment of Mark's mother-in-law, a sequence that has been the subject of intense fan discussion since the comic first published it, is restaged in the show with a slightly different framing that gives Mark a more visible loss of control and gives Angstrom a more visible look of having pushed too far. The change is one of emphasis. The comic stages the moment as a moral horror about what Mark is capable of when sufficiently provoked. The show stages it the same way and adds a layer of interior commentary, both from Mark himself and from the way the camera moves through the scene, that makes the moment feel even more emotionally weighted. The audience knows what Mark is in danger of becoming. The audience knows what Angstrom is trying to make him do. And so the eventual outcome of the confrontation carries a particular kind of weight that the comic version, brutal as it was, did not have access to in quite the same way. Mark's romantic life beyond Amber and Eve is shaped differently in the show than it was in the comic. The comic gives Mark several romantic entanglements over the course of its long run, some serious and some incidental. The show has been more selective about which of these relationships it dramatizes, choosing to keep the core triangle of Amber, Eve, and Mark at the center of the emotional architecture rather than introducing additional romantic partners. The shift is one of focus, and it allows the show to give each of the major relationships more sustained attention than the comic afforded them at the same point. Sex in the show, particularly in the scenes that the comic depicted with a certain frank visual directness, is shaped by the show's animated medium and by the production's choices about what to depict and what to imply. The show is willing to include sexuality in ways that many superhero adaptations are not, and the moments it stages between Mark and Amber, between Eve and Rex, between the Immortal and Kate, and between other characters who have intimate scenes in the comic, are presented with a particular kind of awkward, lived-in honesty that the comic page sometimes did and sometimes did not provide. The shift is one of register. The show is more interested in what sex feels like, awkwardly, ordinarily, and humanly, than the comic was inclined to be at the same points in its narrative. Consent and bodily autonomy as ongoing themes throughout the show is one of the more important framing decisions the production made. The comic raises these questions at various points, but does not always foreground them as themes. The show, by contrast, returns to questions of consent, of body modification without permission, of choices being made for people by people who claim to know better, in storyline after storyline. Cecil's resurrection of Donald, Sinclair's experiments on Rick, Robot's manipulation of Monster Girl, Anissa's assault on Mark, the sequid possession of human bodies, all of these become pieces of a larger argument the show is making about who has the right to decide what happens to whose body. The comic raises some of these questions. The show insists on them as a recurring thematic spine. Mental health, particularly Mark's emerging sense of being unable to cope with the violence of his life, is given more direct dramatization in the show than the comic afforded it. The comic shows Mark struggling, but the show stages that struggle with explicit attention to what trauma looks like in someone Mark's age. The nightmares, the dissociation, the moments when Mark cannot bring himself to fly into another battle. All of these become recurring elements of the show in ways that the comic was less inclined to explicitly dramatize. The deeper attention is part of the show's general interest in interiority, and it gives Mark a particular kind of vulnerability on screen that the page version had less access to. The behind-the-scenes context of the show's production is itself part of its adaptation choices, even when the production details do not appear on screen. The show is produced by Skybound Entertainment, the company founded by Robert Kirkman, and Kirkman himself has remained involved as an executive producer and creative voice throughout the show's run. The show's writer's room has included a number of voices, with Simon Ratchiopa serving as showrunner across multiple seasons, working alongside Kirkman. The animation has been handled primarily by studios with experience in adult-oriented animation, and the production has involved a sustained collaboration between the writer's room and the original comic creators. The presence of Kirkman as an active executive producer means that the show's departures from the comic are happening with the original creators' involvement, which gives those departures a particular kind of authorial blessing that not all adaptations receive. Whatever the show changes, it is changing with Kirkman's signature on the change. The casting process for the show is itself an adaptation choice, and the high-profile names attached to even minor roles tell you something about the production's approach. The decision to fill out the cast with actors known for prestige television and film, rather than for animation work in particular, gives the show a particular kind of vocal texture that distinguishes it from most other superhero animation. The actors are not always trained voice performers. They are bringing performances they have honed in other media, and the result is a vocal landscape that feels more naturalistic, more uneven, more humanly textured than the polished voice work that animation traditionally favors. The change is hard to quantify but easy to feel. The show sounds different from other superhero shows, in part because it is cast differently, and that difference is part of how it translates the comic. Celebrity cameos for one-off roles, including roles that in the comic would have been entirely incidental, become one of the show's running pleasures. Every season has included voice performances from actors whose presence the audience recognizes immediately, and the show has used this device to give individual scenes a particular kind of weight. The comic, of course, has no equivalent. The page can introduce a character with a name and a design, and the reader has no preconception about that character beyond what the page provides. The show, by casting a recognizable voice, gives the character an immediate kind of cultural weight that the page version could not have. The choice is one of the medium translation, and it has become one of the show's signature pleasures for repeat viewers who track the cast. Robert Kirkman's own occasional voice cameo in the show is itself a small adaptation choice with a particular flavor. The comic has no author cameo, of course, beyond the back matter and the letters columns. The show gives Kirkman a small voice presence in occasional scenes, the kind of in-joke that rewards attentive viewers and that connects the show to the larger ecosystem of Skybound Productions. The cameo is small but worth noting, because it is the kind of thing the comic was structurally incapable of doing. Cross-pollination between Invincible and other Skybound properties, including the way characters or visual styles from other Kirkman works occasionally surface in the show, is also worth noting as an adaptation choice. The comic was published in a particular ecosystem of Image Comics releases, and some of its world-building referenced other Image properties, but the show exists in its own ecosystem of Amazon and Skybound Productions. The show has been careful about which connections it makes visible, and which it leaves implicit, but the choices it makes about which cross-references to include are themselves adaptation decisions, with consequences for how attentive viewers read the larger world the show inhabits. The choice to give the show explicit interactions with present-day political and cultural anxieties, including stretches of dialogue and visual presentation that reflect contemporary concerns the comic could not have anticipated, is itself a major adaptation choice. The comic was published over a period that ended in 2018, and the show began airing in 2021, with each subsequent season released into a different cultural moment. The show has been responsive to those moments in ways the comic could not have been, with subtle adjustments to dialogue, to political framing, and to the way certain characters express their views. The shift is largely invisible if you are not looking for it, but it is part of what makes the show feel like a piece of work made for the present moment, rather than a faithful preservation of a comic completed years before. Presidential and governmental figures in the show take a particular shape that the comic was less interested in dramatizing. The comic includes presidents and other officials primarily as plot mechanisms. The show treats these figures with slightly more detail and slightly more concern for what their decisions actually look like, with conversations between Cecil and the executive branch that the comic was more inclined to imply than to stage. That focus reflects the show's interest in institutional accountability as a recurring theme. Cecil is shown answering to people who answer to other people, and that vertical structure becomes part of the show's running argument about the moral cost of national security work. The comic was content to show Cecil largely on his own terms. The show insists on showing him within a chain of command, and that insistence reshapes his ambiguity into something a little less self-contained. The Order, the lower-tier hero team that in the comic occasionally crosses paths with the main cast, has been given slightly more visible presence in the show's larger world, though the specifics of their roster and their deployment vary at various points. The shift is small but consistent with the show's general approach to populating its superhero ecosystem. The comic uses team after team as background color for the larger world. The show gives those teams slightly more specificity, slightly more individual texture, and slightly more visible interaction with the main cast. The cumulative effect is that the show's world feels denser than the comics, even when the actual cast of characters being depicted is largely identical. Capes, Inc., the agency through which heroes find work and structure their professional lives in some of the comic's running gags, is referenced and dramatized in the show with a slightly different sense of humor. The comic plays Capes Inc. largely for comedy, with running jokes about hero employment as a kind of corporate function. The show keeps the comedy, but treats the underlying premise with slightly more attention to what it would actually look like for an agency to manage the careers of superhuman individuals. The shift is small, but consistent with the show's general willingness to take comic gags and find the serious version underneath them. Hideo, the friend of Eve's whose work as a scientist eventually entangles him in the larger superhero ecosystem in the comic, has been given slightly more screen time in the show than the comic provided, by most accounts. The comic uses Hideo primarily as a way to give Eve a relationship that competes for her attention while Mark is unavailable. The show treats him as a person whose presence in Eve's life matters in its own right, and the dynamics between Hideo and Eve are given more attention than the comic afforded them at the same point. The shift is small, but consistent with the show's pattern of treating Eve's life as a story worth caring about, independently of Mark's choices. The Reanimen's eventual incorporation into Cecil's tactical operations is given more visible dramatic weight in the show than the comic provided. The comic shows Cecil using the Reanimen with a certain practical efficiency. The show stages those deployments with more attention to what they look like in practice, what their tactical effectiveness costs morally, and how the other heroes react to seeing Cecil rely on them. The framing is part of the show's broader interest in dramatizing the institutional costs of Cecil's pragmatism, and the recurring presence of the Reanimen in his orbit becomes one of the most visible signs of how far his moral compromises have taken him. The show's handling of Mark's growing physical power, his evolution from a relatively new hero who can barely control his abilities into a Viltrumite warrior who can survive cataclysmic damage, is paced differently than the comic version. The comic shows Mark's power growth across many issues, with specific scenes that mark each escalation. The show compresses some of those escalations and stretches others, with the result that Mark's perceived power level in the show is sometimes ahead of where the comic version of the same point in the story put him, and sometimes behind. The pacing difference is one of rhythm rather than substance, but it has consequences for how the audience reads the threat level of various antagonists. The show's specific visual language for Mark's flight, his combat stances, his moments of impact and recovery, is its own significant adaptation choice. The comic gives Mark a particular visual rhythm in the air, with poses and movements that the artist developed over time. The show inherits that rhythm and translates it into animated motion, with specific choices about how Mark accelerates, decelerates, lands, recovers, and reacts to impact. Those choices give the show's Mark a slightly different physical presence than the comic version had. He moves a particular way. He fights a particular way. He carries his body in the air with a particular weight. None of those things are precisely what the comic depicted, because the comic could only depict frozen instants, and the show has had to invent the motion between them. The choice to use particular visual styles for moments of extreme power, including the way Mark's Viltrumite physiology is depicted when he is pushed to the edge of his abilities, is itself an adaptation choice with no direct comic equivalent. The comic uses dramatic line work and color to convey intensity, but the show has to use specific animation techniques, specific particle effects, specific changes in the framing of the action. Those techniques have to be invented for the show, and they have become part of the show's recognizable visual signature in ways that the comic could only gesture toward. Grief in the show, including the long sustained sequences in which characters sit with what has been lost, is given more attention than the comic generally provided. The comic shows grief, but it tends to move through grief in a few panels before returning to the forward momentum of the plot. The show, by contrast, has been willing to let an episode slow down, sometimes for substantial stretches, to give the characters time to mourn. The conversations between Debbie and Mark about Nolan, the conversations between Eve and Rex about William, the conversations between the Immortal and Kate about what they have lost, all of these are given more time in the show than the comic afforded them at the same point. The lingering is part of what makes the show feel emotionally heavier than the comic, and it is one of the most consistent patterns of adaptation across the series. Comedy, particularly the way the show balances its harshest violence with moments of genuine humor, is a more careful operation than the comic generally bothered with. The comic is funny, but it tends to deliver its humor in specific scenes that are clearly designated for it. The show weaves humor through scenes that are also doing other things. A conversation between Mark and Eve about a difficult subject can have jokes in it. A confrontation with Cecil can have jokes in it. A scene of mourning can have jokes in it. The comic was sometimes willing to do this and sometimes not. The show is consistently willing, and the result is a tonal blend that the comic only occasionally achieved. Food, meals, kitchens, the everyday domestic rhythm of the Grayson household are given more attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic includes occasional kitchen scenes, but the show treats the kitchen of the Grayson home as a recurring emotional environment. We see Debbie cooking, we see Mark eating, we see Nolan at the table, we see, after Nolan is gone, the empty chair he used to sit in. The shift is subtle but consistent. The kitchen becomes one of the show's most recognizable visual environments, and its emotional valence changes as the family inside it changes. The comic could not have lingered on that environment in the same way without sacrificing pacing. The show is willing to spend a few seconds in the kitchen at the beginning of an episode, and those few seconds become part of how the audience reads the entire emotional landscape of the family. Physical wounds, scars, and ongoing injury are more visible in the show than the comics. The comic shows Mark accumulating damage across his career, but the show treats his scars as visible reminders that persist between episodes. We see him with bandages, we see him with bruises, we see him healing slowly, with the kind of incremental physical recovery that the comic was less inclined to dramatize. The persistence is consistent with the show's general interest in showing the cost of being a superhero, and it gives the show's depiction of injury a particular kind of believability that the comic, with its flatter color and more economical panel layouts, did not always achieve. The way characters age in the show, particularly the way Mark visibly grows up over the course of multiple seasons, is given more attention than the comic provided at the same point. The comic depicts Mark's growth primarily through changes in his costume, his hair, and his stature, but the show is able to make those changes more gradually and more visibly through the cumulative work of the animation team. Mark's face changes slightly between seasons. His voice carries a slightly different weight. His body language becomes more confident in some scenes and more weary in others. The shift is the work of an animation production that has been thinking about its lead character as someone who is growing up in real time, and that thinking gives the show a particular kind of long-form character development that the comic could only approximate through static design changes. Debbie's aging in the show is its own quiet adaptation choice. The comic shows Debbie growing older across the run, but the show treats her aging as a visible part of her grief. She looks tired in ways the comic could not have made as immediately visible. She moves more slowly in some scenes. Her hair changes in ways that suggest she is no longer trying to perform youth for anyone. The change is small but consistent, and it is part of what gives the show's Debbie a particular kind of dignity that the page version had to assert more explicitly. The way the Immortal physically holds his ancient age is itself a visible adaptation choice. The comic shows the Immortal as a tall, broad-shouldered hero whose body looks like the bodies of other heroes. The show, while keeping the same general design, gives the Immortal a particular kind of stillness, a slow rhythm of speech, a deliberate carriage that suggests a man who has been alive for a very long time and who has had to learn to slow down in order to bear it. The shift is small but consistent, and it gives the show's Immortal a particular kind of dignity that the page version could only suggest. The visual presentation of Viltrumite warriors generally, including the way they hold themselves, the way they fight, and the way they speak, has been adjusted in the show to give them a particular kind of uniform menace. The comic depicts Viltrumites with similar designs but with somewhat different personalities. The show keeps the personalities and adds a layer of physical discipline that makes every Viltrumite recognizable as a member of the same warrior culture. The change is one of texture, and it makes the eventual confrontations with the Viltrumite Empire feel like clashes with a real culture rather than with a series of individual antagonists. Language in the show, particularly the way the Viltrumite language is occasionally depicted on screen with subtitles or with on-screen translation, is its own adaptation choice. The comic depicts the Viltrumite language primarily through dialogue captioning. The show has more options for how to convey that language is being spoken, and it uses those options selectively, depending on whether it wants the audience to feel the Viltrumites as familiar or as foreign in a given scene. The shift is subtle but consistent, and it gives the show a particular kind of attention to the social texture of the Viltrumite Empire that the comic was less inclined to foreground. Thraxan language, Atlantean language, and various other non-human languages in the show are similarly more visible than they were in the comic. The comic uses these languages primarily as a plot device. The show treats them as part of the texture of the world, with specific scenes in which Mark has to deal with not being understood, with not understanding, with the awkward in-between of trying to communicate across linguistic barriers. The shift is small but consistent, and it gives the show's larger world a more textured sense of being populated by real cultures, rather than by convenient antagonists. Large-scale destruction in the show, with cities being damaged or destroyed across various sequences, is its own significant adaptation choice. The comic stages these moments with the economy of comic page panel construction. The show is able to dwell on the destruction, to follow individual debris across the air, to show specific buildings collapsing in specific ways. Those choices give the show's large-scale destruction a particular kind of weight that the comic, with its more economical visual storytelling, could only suggest. The shift is one of duration, and it makes the show's worst sequences feel substantially heavier than the comic's worst sequences, even when the events being depicted are identical. Civilian casualties, both as numbers and as individual lives, are depicted more explicitly than the comic's depiction of the same events. The comic shows civilians dying, but the show is willing to focus on specific civilians, to give them moments of life before they are killed, to show their families learning what happened. The focus is part of the show's general insistence on the personhood of the people the comic was sometimes willing to use as background color, and it gives the show's destruction sequences a particular kind of moral weight that the comic's versions of the same sequences did not always have. Mark's eventual identity crises, including the way the show stages his moments of feeling like his father, of failing to be the kind of hero he wants to be, of making decisions he cannot quite justify, are given more attention than the comic afforded. The comic shows these moments, but the show is willing to spend longer with them, to let them sit, to refuse to resolve them quickly. The audience watches Mark face the possibility that he is not the hero he wanted to be, and the show refuses to give him an easy way out of that question. The patience is part of the show's general interest in interiority, and it is one of the most consistent ways the adaptation transforms its source material into something with a different kind of emotional gravity. The coalition of planets, the multi-species alliance that becomes a major force in the comic's later interstellar plotting, has been seated in the show with more attention than the comic gave it at the comparable point in its run. The comic introduces the coalition primarily through Alan the Alien, who functions as both a friend to Mark and a representative of an organization that is trying to push back against Viltrum's expansion. The show keeps that structure intact and adds more visible texture to the coalition itself, with named members, specific cultural details, and a clearer sense of what it would mean to actually function as an opposition movement to a galactic empire. The shift is one of degree rather than substance. The coalition is the same coalition. It simply has more recognizable presence on screen than it ever did on the page at the same point. Space Racer, the comic's interstellar bounty hunter with a particular kind of pulpy sensibility, is given a slightly different visual presentation in the show, and a slightly different tonal register. The comic uses Space Racer largely as a deliberate throwback to older science fiction, with knowing humor about the conventions of pulp adventure. The show keeps the humor but treats Space Racer with slightly more gravity, particularly when his presence intersects with the more emotionally weighted plots of the larger story. The shift is small, but it shows how the show has been willing to take comic characters who were initially used primarily as gags and find the serious version of them when the story needs that version. Pulp influences in the show, including the way Invincible's larger world acknowledges its debts to older comics, older science fiction, and older superhero traditions, are themselves an adaptation choice. The comic wears its influences openly, with references and visual jokes throughout the run. The show keeps most of those references intact but adapts them for a different audience, with different cultural touchstones, and with a slightly different awareness of which references will land. The shift is one of curation rather than of substance, and it gives the show a particular kind of self-awareness that the comic was sometimes more casual about. Religion in the show is given a particular kind of subtlety that the comic was sometimes less careful with. The comic includes references to religion, including the presence of demonic figures like Damien Darkblood, with a certain matter-of-factness. The show treats these elements with slightly more weight, with attention to what it would actually mean for a demon detective to exist in the same world as Viltrumite invaders, and with a clearer sense that the cosmology of the comic includes spaces the audience does not necessarily understand. The shift is small but consistent, and it gives the show a particular kind of theological undertone that the comic was less inclined to explicitly develop. The astounding Wolfman, who in the comic exists in a shared world with Invincible, and occasionally crosses into the main book's storylines, is referenced in the show with a particular kind of care. The comic could move freely between its various properties because they shared a publisher and an author. The show, operating in a different rights ecosystem, has been more selective about which connections it makes visible, and the references that do appear are calibrated to reward attentive viewers without confusing newcomers. The change is one of rights and ecosystem rather than of substance, but it has consequences for how the show's larger world feels populated. The Brit, another skybound character whose world overlaps with Invincible's in the comic, is similarly handled with a particular kind of selective reference in the show. The crossovers between Brit and Invincible in the comic are part of the larger Image and Skybound shared universe. The show has been careful about which of these connections it dramatizes, and which it leaves implicit, and the choices made here reflect the larger reality of how shared universes translate from the comic page to the television screen. Tech Jacket, who in the comic shares some storylines with Invincible, is treated in the show with similar selectivity. The comic's freedom to move characters between books does not translate cleanly to television, and the show has had to decide which of these connections to keep and which to let go. The change is invisible if you have not read the comics, but it is one of the more interesting examples of how an adaptation has to navigate the realities of its production ecosystem. The way the show structures its action choreography, particularly the multi-opponent fights that feature prominently in many of its biggest sequences, is its own significant adaptation choice. The comic stages fights with the conventions of comic page composition, which means individual panels, dramatic poses, and the white space between actions. The show has to find ways to translate that staging into continuous motion, and it has developed a particular kind of choreographic style that mixes anime-style speed bursts with the impact-heavy visual sensibility of American superhero animation. The change is invisible if you are not thinking about it, but every fight in the show is the work of a team translating panel staging into kinetic action, and the result is a fight style that does not exist anywhere else in animated superhero adaptation. Slow motion in particular fight sequences is its own adaptation choice, with no direct comic equivalent. The comic, of course, has no time. Every panel is a moment, frozen and selected by the artist. The show has the option of slowing down a moment, of making it last longer than it would in real time, and the choices it makes about when to do this are themselves part of the adaptation. The famous beats of impact, the moments when a punch connects or a body falls, are sometimes given slow motion treatment in the show in ways that the comic could only suggest through panel composition. The technique gives the show's most violent moments a particular kind of weight that the comic, with its more economical visual storytelling, had to convey through different means. Repeated visual motifs across episodes are themselves an adaptation choice. The comic has its recurring visual elements, but the show has developed specific images that recur across the seasons, including the windowless room, the empty kitchen chair, the blood-stained title sequence, and the silhouette of Nolan flying away. These images become part of the show's emotional vocabulary, and they are the work of an animation team building a particular kind of memory across episodes. The comic has its iconic images, but they tend to function within individual issues. The show's recurring images function across years of viewing, and they accumulate weight in a way that the comic format did not always allow. The way the show stages the discovery of Nolan's true mission, the moment when various characters learn that the Viltrumites are not heroes but conquerors, is given different timing for different characters. In the comic, the revelation lands at specific points for specific characters. The show has rearranged some of those timings, partly because the audience already knows the truth from episode 1, and partly because the show wants to dramatize the cost of learning, rather than just the fact of learning. Debbie learns at one point, Cecil learns at another, Eve learns at another. Each learning is staged with attention to what it costs the character, and the cumulative effect is that the show treats Nolan's secret as a kind of ongoing wound that radiates outward from him into the lives of everyone he loved. The handling of Donald's slow realization of what has been done to him is one of the most affecting examples of this pattern. The comic version of Donald already includes the cyborg revelation as part of his backstory, but the page stages it as a relatively quick reveal among many. The show invents an extended dramatization of his slow piecing together, and gives it some of the most quietly devastating scenes in the entire run, with Donald gradually understanding the truth about his own body and his own service. The expansion fits seamlessly with the comic's larger interest in moral compromise, and it gives the show a piece of expanded storytelling that feels entirely consistent with the source material's voice. The supporting heroes who serve under Cecil and the Global Defense Agency are given more visible texture in the show than the comic provided. The comic gives Cecil his lieutenants and operatives as functional staff. The show treats them as people with their own running concerns, their own arguments with each other, their own relationships with the heroes they coordinate with. That fuller attention is consistent with the show's general interest in giving institutional environments a more humanly populated feel, and it makes Cecil's apparatus feel more like a working organization than the comic's somewhat more abstract treatment. Cecil's family life and any descendants who feature in some of the comic's later storylines are something the show has handled with patience, although some fan accounts of specific names and relationships from the comic remain debated. The show has been positioning Cecil's private life with selective glimpses and selective silences, and how it eventually stages the more personal corners of Cecil's world will likely be reshaped to fit the show's particular emotional architecture rather than any specific arc the comic ran. Kid Omni-Man, the eventual hero identity that Oliver takes on as he grows into his powers, is given a particular kind of staging in the show that emphasizes the parental anxiety surrounding his arc. The comic stages Oliver's growth into a hero with a certain kind of plot momentum. The show, knowing the audience has spent more time with Oliver as a small boy, treats his early hero work with more visible concern from Mark, from Debbie, and from the larger Grayson family. The framing makes Oliver's emergence as a hero feel more like a family event than the comic version's more abstract treatment. Tara, the daughter Mark eventually has with Eve in the comic's distant future, has not yet been directly dramatized in the show, as the series has not yet reached that point in the larger arc. The comic's treatment of Tara and the future timeline she represents is one of the most ambitious, sustained pieces of long-form storytelling the source material attempts. The show has been positioning Mark and Eve's relationship with patience that suggests it understands the eventual weight of the Tara storyline, but the specifics of how it will handle that storyline remain to be seen. Any speculation about exactly how the show approaches Tara would be exactly that, speculation, and the show has reserved the right to depart from the comic in significant ways whenever it has felt that a different ending would serve the story better. The future timeline more generally, the comic's bold long-term decision to follow Mark and the larger cast across decades, is one of the most ambitious storytelling choices the comic ever made, and how the show eventually handles this temporal scope remains to be seen. The comic's willingness to age its characters, to show them as parents, to show them as grandparents, to follow them into their gray hair and their quieter lives, is one of its most distinctive features. The show has been positioning the early seasons with attention to the foundations these later arcs will require, but the specific structural choices around how to dramatize the later timeline are choices the production will have to make as it approaches them. Robot's eventual rise to political power, his ambition to remake the world according to his own ethical vision, is one of the comic's most morally complex arcs. The show has been seeding Robot's interest in larger systemic change for several seasons, and the eventual dramatization of his ambition will involve choices about how to balance his individual psychology against the political stakes of his ambitions. The comic gives Robot considerable space to develop his ideology. The show, with its compressed timeline, may have to compress some of that development, and the eventual landing of the arc may carry a slightly different emphasis than the comic's version. The eventual conflict between Robot and Mark, when their philosophies and methods finally come into open opposition, will be one of the most important adaptation decisions the show has to make. The comic stages this conflict with particular care, and the show has been preparing for it through the long seeding of Robot's ambitions across multiple seasons. The eventual dramatization will involve choices about pacing, about emotional weight, and about how to balance Robot's recognizable humanity against the inhuman scale of his ambitions. The comic's eventual epilogue, the long, sustained look at what comes after the larger conflicts have been resolved, is one of the most distinctive features of the source material. The comic does not end at the final confrontation. It ends with years of quieter time, with grown children, with marriages, with funerals, with the slow accumulation of life after spectacle. Whether and how the show will eventually approach this epilogue is one of the most interesting open questions about the entire adaptation. The comic's commitment to showing what happens after is part of what made it feel like a complete story rather than a continuing series, and the show's eventual choices about how to honor that commitment will shape how the entire adaptation is remembered. The choice to release the show on Amazon Prime Video, rather than on a more general broadcaster, shapes the kind of show the production has been able to make. The comic's content, including its violence, its sexuality, and its general willingness to depict adult subject matter, would have been difficult to translate to a more family-oriented broadcast environment. Amazon's streaming context allowed the show to keep the comic's adult tone intact, with the corresponding freedom to depict consequences in ways that more cautious adaptations would have had to soften. The choice is invisible if you are watching the show, but it is part of why the show feels like a faithful adaptation of the comic's spirit, rather than a sanitized version. The release schedule of the show, with episodes generally released weekly within each half season, has shaped how the audience encounters the story. The comic was released monthly, with each issue arriving as a discrete unit of approximately 20 pages. The show's weekly release of episodes lasting roughly 45 minutes is a different rhythm, with different consequences for how the audience processes each unit of story. The shift is one of temporal experience rather than of content, but it has shaped the kind of conversations the show has been able to generate among its audience, and the kind of anticipation each episode has been able to build. The marketing and public conversation around the show is itself part of how the adaptation has shaped the comic's legacy. The show has reached an audience considerably larger than the comic ever did, and the conversation about the source material has been transformed by that reach. People who never picked up an issue now know the names of the characters. People who would never have walked into a comic shop know about the windowless room. The shift is one of cultural visibility rather than of textual substance, but it has shaped the kind of object Invincible now is in the larger culture, and the show is a significant part of that transformation. Female characters generally receive one of the most thoughtful patterns of change across the entire adaptation. The comic was published over a period during which the conventions of superhero storytelling were going through significant reconsideration, and Robert Kirkman has discussed in various interviews how his own thinking about how to write female characters evolved across the run. The show takes the comic's female characters and gives them, almost without exception, more interior life, more visible motivation, and more sustained attention than the comic afforded them at the same point in the story. Debbie, Amber, Eve, Kate, Monster Girl, Shrinking Ray, Andressa, Anissa, all of these characters receive more screen time, more dialogue, and more interior monologue than their comic counterparts had at the equivalent stage. The shift is not a rewriting of the comic. It is an enlargement of it, and it reflects the show's awareness of which elements of the source material would benefit from contemporary recalibration. Amber Bennett's race and her family background are given more visible texture in the show than the comic provided. The comic gives Amber a specific identity, but does not always foreground it as part of her characterization. The show treats Amber's background as part of who she is, with specific scenes that touch on her family, her cultural context, and the particular challenges she faces as a person of color in the larger world the show depicts. The shift is small but consistent, and it gives Amber a particular kind of grounded specificity that the comic version had to assert more selectively. Mark Grayson's own racial identity, including the way the show acknowledges his half-Korean background through his casting and through specific small visual and verbal cues, is itself an adaptation choice with consequences. The comic depicts Mark with a particular generic American superhero look that did not particularly foreground his ethnic background. The show, by casting Steven Yeun and by acknowledging Mark's heritage in small but specific ways, gives the character a layer of identity the comic was less inclined to dramatize. The shift is subtle, but it shapes how Mark reads as a character and how his family reads as a family. The show's various international settings, including the locations Mark visits during his early hero career and the global stretch of the larger superhero ecosystem, are given more visible texture than the comic provided. The comic shows international settings primarily through dialogue and through occasional establishing panels. The show is willing to spend longer in these settings, to depict the specific architectural and cultural texture of the places it visits, and to treat the global scope of the superhero work as part of the show's running argument about scale. The shift is consistent with the show's general interest in making the world feel populated rather than abstract. Upstate University, as a specific location with its own visual identity, its own recurring characters, and its own running concerns, is given more attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic uses the college primarily as a setting for specific plot beats. The show treats it as a place where Mark actually lives, with specific dorm rooms, specific classrooms, specific friendships that develop over time. The shift is part of the show's general insistence on making its settings feel inhabited rather than merely indicated, and it gives Mark's college years a particular kind of texture that the comic was less inclined to develop at the same length. Class sessions, professors, and academic experiences in Mark's college life become themselves a small adaptation choice. The comic includes occasional academic scenes, but tends to move through them quickly. The show is willing to stage longer sequences inside classrooms, with specific professors who recur, with specific academic concerns Mark has to navigate alongside his hero work. The framing is small, but consistent with the show's general interest in showing the cost of Mark's divided life, and the academic scenes become part of the texture of his struggle to be a normal young man, while also serving as a planetary defender. Homework, assignments left undone, grades slipping while Mark is off saving the world, all of it is given more visible attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic uses these elements as occasional jokes about Mark's overstretched life. The show treats them with slightly more weight, showing the specific consequences of failing to keep up with a normal college schedule. The shift is small, but it contributes to the show's overall picture of Mark as someone who is failing at the ordinary parts of his life, because the extraordinary parts will not leave him alone. Friendship as a sustained subject in the show is given more careful attention than the comic provided. The comic includes friendships, but the show treats them as central rather than incidental. Mark's friendships with William, with Eve, with Alan, with Rex over time, with Oliver as Oliver grows, are given more sustained dramatization than the comic afforded. The framing is part of the show's general insistence on the personhood of the supporting cast, and it gives the show's larger emotional architecture a particular kind of warmth that the comic was sometimes less inclined to foreground. Moments of joy, of small everyday pleasure, of characters simply enjoying being alive, are given more attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic includes such moments, but tends to move past them quickly in favor of plot momentum. The show is willing to dwell on a moment of laughter, of shared food, of small kindnesses between characters. The shift is subtle but consistent, and it gives the show a particular tonal texture in which the violence reads differently against the backdrop of these quiet pleasures. The comic is darker, on the page, partly because it lingers less on the lighter moments. The show, by lingering on them, makes the dark moments feel even darker by contrast. Physical contact, hugs, hand-holding, small moments of bodily comfort between characters, all of it is given more sustained attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic depicts these moments but tends to move past them quickly. The show is willing to hold on a hug, to let a hand rest on another's, to dramatize the small bodily comforts that make the larger story bearable. The shift is small but consistent, and it gives the show's depiction of family and friendship a particular kind of physical reality that the comic was sometimes less inclined to develop. Clothing changes, characters in pajamas, characters in casual wear, characters dressed for specific occasions, are given more visible attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic depicts these moments, but with the economy of comic page composition. The show is willing to spend time on the texture of fabric, on the specific cut of a piece of clothing, on the way a character looks when they are not in their hero costume. The attention is small, but it contributes to the show's overall sense of the characters as people who have lives outside of their hero work, and the costume changes themselves become part of the visual rhythm of the show in ways the comic could not quite replicate. Weather, seasons, specific times of year, all of it is given more visible attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic indicates these things primarily through dialogue and through occasional visual cues. The show is willing to depict snow on the streets, rain on windows, the specific quality of late summer light. The detail is small, but it gives the show a particular kind of temporal grounding, with episodes that feel like they take place in specific moments of the year rather than in a generic comic book present. Holidays, specific cultural celebrations, family events that fall on particular dates, are given more attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic includes occasional holiday scenes but does not foreground them as part of the family's emotional life. The show treats holidays as moments when the absence of Nolan, in particular, is felt with particular intensity. The shift is small, but it contributes to the show's overall picture of the Grayson family as a unit that is missing something it cannot replace. Birthdays, anniversaries, specific personal dates that mark the passage of time are given more attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic moves through these moments quickly. The show is willing to dwell on a birthday party, on the specific cake, on the specific moment when Mark realizes that another year has gone by without his father at the table. The attention is small but consistent, and it gives the show a particular kind of temporal attention that the comic was sometimes more abstract about. Pets. The small animals that occasionally appear in the corners of various scenes get more attention in the show than the comic generally provided. The comic includes occasional animals, but tends to use them primarily as visual gags. The show treats them with slightly more presence, with specific dogs and cats appearing in specific homes as part of the larger texture of the world. The detail is tiny but consistent with the show's general insistence on populating its world with the small details of ordinary life. Public transportation, the buses and trains and taxis that move characters around the city, also gets more visible attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic shows characters traveling, but does not always foreground the specific means by which they travel. The show is willing to depict bus stops, train platforms, and the everyday rhythms of urban life. The attention is small, but it contributes to the show's overall sense of the city as a real environment with real infrastructure, rather than a generic backdrop for hero work. News media, the newspapers and broadcast television and online coverage of the superhero events depicted in the show is given more visible attention than the comic provided. The comic includes occasional newspaper headlines but does not foreground media coverage as part of the texture of the world. The show is willing to depict news anchors discussing the events, talk shows debating the moral consequences, and online communities reacting to specific incidents. The framing is consistent with the show's general interest in showing the public face of the events the heroes have to navigate, and it gives the larger world a particular kind of contemporary texture that the comic was less inclined to develop at the same length. Public opinion about superheroes, the way various publics react to the existence of beings with these powers, is given more visible texture in the show than the comic provided. The comic touches on these questions, but tends to move through them quickly. The show is willing to dramatize the specific concerns of specific communities, the specific fears about what these heroes can do, the specific resentments about the destruction that follows them. The deeper engagement is part of the show's general interest in institutional and social complexity, and it gives the larger world a particular kind of political weight that the comic was sometimes more casual about. Specific government agencies beyond the Global Defense Agency, including the various national and international institutions that have to coordinate with Cecil's operation, are given more visible texture in the show than the comic provided. The comic indicates these agencies primarily through dialogue. The show is willing to stage scenes inside other government buildings, with other officials, with other reporting structures that the comic was less inclined to dramatize. The expansion is part of the show's general institutional interest, and it gives Cecil's particular operation a clearer sense of being one node in a larger global network rather than a self-contained entity. International diplomacy, the way various nations have to negotiate with each other in response to the events depicted in the show, gets more visible attention than the comic provided. The comic touches on these questions occasionally. The show treats them as part of the recurring texture of the world, with specific scenes that depict the political consequences of superhero work as a recurring concern. The framing is consistent with the show's general interest in showing the larger consequences of the action it depicts, and it gives the larger world a particular kind of political density that the comic was less inclined to develop. Specific time period markers, the way the show acknowledges the years passing both in its own story and in the cultural moment of its production, are given a particular kind of subtlety. The comic was published over a long period, and its cultural references reflect the moments of its publication. The show, beginning publication well after the comic's conclusion, has had to decide how to position itself temporally. It generally treats its events as contemporary, with technology, references, and cultural touchstones drawn from its own production years rather than from the comic's original publication moment. The shift is largely invisible to viewers, but it has consequences for how the show feels as a piece of contemporary culture rather than as a faithful preservation of a comic from another era. Running visual gags that recur across the show, including specific repeated images that the comic did not necessarily set up as motifs, are themselves a significant adaptation choice. The show develops particular shots, particular framings, particular visual rhymes that come to mean something to attentive viewers. The blood-stained ceiling of a particular hallway, the closed door of a particular bedroom, the particular angle from which Mark first sees his father from above. These recurring images are the work of an animation team building a visual vocabulary across seasons, and they have no direct comic equivalent because the comic page does not generally function with repeated framing in the same way. The cultural conversation about the show, including the way specific moments and lines have become recognizable within internet culture, has reshaped how the comic itself is now perceived. The famous father-son monologue from the Season 1 finale has become one of the most recognizable lines in contemporary animated television, and people who have never read the comic now recognize it instantly. The shift here is not in the source material itself, but in how the source material exists in the larger culture, and the show has done more to expand the cultural footprint of Invincible than any other medium that has tried to engage with the property. The comic continues to exist as it was, but it now exists alongside the show, and the show has shaped how new readers approach the comic. The way the show has handled the inevitable comparisons to other superhero adaptations, both animated and live action, is its own piece of cultural work. The comic existed in a particular ecosystem of independent superhero comics, with its own peer group and its own conversations. The show has had to position itself against a much larger and more visible field of superhero adaptations, including the ongoing Marvel Cinematic Universe, the various DC properties, and the larger landscape of adult animated content from various studios. The choices the show has made about how to differentiate itself from these other properties, while still functioning within the same broad genre, are themselves adaptation choices with consequences for the kind of object the show now is. The impact of the show on comic book sales for the source material is itself a piece of the larger cultural story. The comic, which had concluded its publication before the show began airing, has seen renewed interest as new readers encounter the source material through the adaptation. The reprints, the omnibus editions, the various collected formats have moved through new audiences in ways that the original publication did not always reach. The shift is one of audience and reach rather than of textual substance, but it has shaped how Invincible exists as a piece of intellectual property in the present moment, and the show has been the central engine of that renewed visibility. The show's various production challenges, including the impact of broader industry disruptions on its release schedule, are themselves part of the adaptation story. The show's release timeline has been affected by various external factors, and the specific gaps between seasons have been longer than the production initially anticipated. Those gaps have shaped how the audience encounters the story, with each season landing into a slightly different cultural moment than the production may have originally anticipated. The change is one of external pressure rather than of internal choice, but it has consequences for how the show feels as a piece of ongoing serial storytelling. Voice acting continuity across seasons, with the show working to retain its core cast across the entire run, is itself an achievement worth noting. Animation productions of this length often see cast turnover for various reasons, and the show's success in keeping its principal voices intact across multiple seasons has been one of the quiet successes of the production. The shift here is the absence of change, and it gives the show a particular kind of vocal continuity that the comic, which has no equivalent concern, could not have replicated in any meaningful way. Writing room continuity is a similar piece of production history. The show has retained core creative voices across its run, with sustained involvement from key writers and producers that has given the storytelling a particular kind of consistency. The comic, written primarily by a single author, had its own kind of consistency. The show, written by a room of voices, has had to develop a different kind, and the success of that effort is visible in the way the show maintains its tone across episodes and across seasons. The comic's most famous specific moments, the panels and pages that have become iconic for longtime readers, get particular care in the show. The famous panels have been adapted with attention to making them recognizable for readers who know them, while still functioning as moments of dramatic action for viewers who do not. The careful balancing act of adaptation translates each iconic moment rather than simply reproducing it. The result is that longtime readers see the original moment refracted through animation, while new viewers experience the moment as part of the show's own storytelling, and both audiences can find the moment satisfying in their own ways. The show's approach to spoilers, with episodes that diverge from the comic in unexpected places, is itself an adaptation choice with consequences for both audiences. The comic readers cannot fully predict what the show will do, because the show has reserved the right to depart from the source whenever it serves the story. The new viewers cannot fully predict what the show will do either, because the show is its own thing. The result is that both audiences experience the show with a particular kind of suspense, and the choices the show has made about which comic events to keep, which to change, and which to invent entirely are themselves part of the ongoing tension of watching the adaptation unfold. The Mark Grayson who watches his father do terrible things, who recognizes the cost of those things, and who has to decide whether to stay loyal to a man he loves or to oppose him, gets more sustained emotional dramatization in the show than the comic provided at the same point. The comic shows Mark wrestling with this question. The show shows him wrestling with it across episodes, across seasons, across phases of his life, that the comic was content to move through more quickly. The patience is consistent with the show's general interest in interiority, and it gives Mark's central moral struggle a particular kind of weight that the comic's brisker pacing did not always permit. Mark's eventual moments of taking on the role his father vacated, of becoming the kind of hero the planet needs without becoming the kind of monster his father became, get more sustained dramatization in the show than the comic provided. The comic stages these moments with particular care. The show is willing to spend more time with the small, everyday decisions that constitute Mark's choice to be different. The extension is one of duration, and it makes Mark's heroism feel like a sustained moral effort rather than a series of dramatic decisions. Mark's failures, the moments when he does not live up to his own ideals, the moments when he hurts people he should have protected, are given more sustained dramatization in the show than the comic provided. The comic includes these moments. The show insists on them, and refuses to let Mark off easily for them. The insistence is part of what gives the show its particular kind of moral seriousness, and it is one of the most consistent ways the adaptation transforms its source material into a story about a young man learning to live with his own limitations. Mark's eventual reconciliations, the moments when he finds his way back to people he has hurt or alienated, also receive more sustained attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic stages these reconciliations. The show is willing to spend more time with the awkward, uncertain, halting work of repair. The patience is consistent with the show's broader interest in emotional honesty, and it gives the reconciliations a particular kind of believability that the comic version's brisker pacing did not always achieve. Mark's relationship with his mother across the entire run is one of the most carefully maintained pieces of the adaptation. The comic gives Mark and Debbie a strong relationship that is never the center of the story. The show keeps that exact relationship and gives it more screen time, more dialogue, more silent moments between them. The emphasis makes the Grayson family feel like a real two-person unit after Nolan's departure, rather than a single Mark navigating a world by himself. The bond between Mark and Debbie becomes one of the show's most quietly moving achievements, and it is the result of a sustained adaptation choice to insist on the importance of that relationship throughout the run. Mark's eventual relationships with younger heroes, including his role as a kind of older brother or mentor figure to Oliver and to other characters who look up to him, are given more sustained attention in the show than the comic provided. The comic shows Mark in this role at various points. The show treats it as a recurring part of who Mark is becoming, with specific scenes that dramatize his attempts to be a better example than the father he had. The choice is consistent with the show's general interest in showing Mark's slow accumulation of moral identity, and it gives the mentorship arcs a particular kind of weight that the comic was sometimes less inclined to develop at the same length. The accumulation of all of these changes, across hundreds of small and large decisions, produces a show that is recognizably the same story as the comic, and yet experienced very differently from it. The events are largely the same, the characters are largely the same, the major beats hit at largely the same points, and yet the show, by giving everything just a little more time, a little more attention, a little more interior weight, becomes something that exists alongside the comic, rather than simply reproducing it. The comic remains itself. The show is its own thing, made with respect for the comic, and with the freedom to do what television needs to do that comics cannot. The two media now exist together, with each one shaping how new audiences encounter the other. That mutual shaping is itself perhaps the largest change the show has made to the comic. The comic, before the show, existed primarily within its own subculture, beloved by readers who had found it through specific channels, with a reputation for being one of the great independent superhero books of its era. The show has expanded the comic's audience by orders of magnitude, has changed the kind of object the comic now is in the larger culture, and has shaped how the comic will be remembered going forward. Whatever the show eventually does with its remaining stories, whatever endings it chooses, whatever final shape it takes, it has already changed the comic by changing the cultural context in which the comic exists. That is the largest single change the show has made, and it is the kind of change no individual scene or episode can fully account for. Specific season finales become one of the show's most carefully managed adaptation patterns. Each season has had to find an ending that functions both as a satisfying conclusion to its own arc, and as a launching point for the season that follows. And the choices the show has made about where to end each season often diverge significantly from where the comic's equivalent arcs concluded. The comic could break its larger arcs across issues with the freedom of a serial that knew it would continue monthly. The show has had to find ending points that work as discrete television seasons, with cliffhangers that justify long waits and resolutions that justify the time the audience has just spent. Each season ending is therefore a piece of adaptation work that the comic version of the same material did not have to perform in the same way. The Viltrumite invasion of Earth, when the show eventually stages it, will be one of the most significant pieces of adaptation work the production has to undertake. The comic gives the Viltrumite arrival particular weight, with substantial casualties, prolonged combat, and consequences that ripple through the rest of the run. The show has been building toward this moment with patience, and the eventual dramatization will involve choices about how to balance spectacle against intimate emotional consequence. The comic could rely on the cumulative weight of many issues of build-up. The show will have to deliver comparable weight within its compressed timeline, and the choices it makes will shape how the rest of the series feels going forward. The eventual piece, the long process by which the various conflicts of the larger story are eventually resolved, is one of the comic's most distinctive features. The comic refuses to end at the largest battle. It insists on showing what comes after, what life looks like when the wars are over, what the survivors do with the rest of their lives. Whether and how the show will honor this commitment to showing the aftermath is one of the most interesting open questions about the entire adaptation. The temptation to end on the largest dramatic note is significant, and the comic's choice to keep going past that note is one of its most distinctive structural decisions. The show's eventual handling of that choice will be one of the most consequential adaptation decisions still ahead. The show's relationship to its audience, including the way it has built a community of viewers who discuss each episode and each season with sustained engagement, is itself a piece of how the adaptation has shaped the source material. The comic had its readers, but the show has its viewers, and the conversations the show has generated have been different in scale and in form from the conversations the comic generated during its original run. The shift is not in the source material itself, but in how it now exists as a piece of ongoing cultural conversation. And that conversation has been one of the most important products of the adaptation. The show's eventual ending, whenever it comes and whatever shape it takes, will be the largest single adaptation choice the production has to make. The comic ended with a particular kind of resolution, with specific final moments that have been the subject of much reader discussion. The show's ending could honor that resolution closely, could depart from it in significant ways, or could find some middle path that respects the comic while doing what the show needs to do. Whatever choice the production eventually makes, it will be the choice that defines the entire adaptation, and the cumulative weight of every smaller change the show has made will set the table for that final decision. The Mark Grayson the show eventually delivers, after all of the changes the production has made, is recognizably the Mark Grayson of the comic, and is also a slightly different Mark Grayson than the comic delivered. He has been given more interior life, more vocal texture, more visible moral weight, and more sustained dramatization than the comic version of him received at the same points in his arc. He is the same character, with the same powers, the same family, and the same central moral struggle, and he is also a character whose particular performance and particular pacing have given him a slightly different shape than the page version. That double identity, of being the same character and a slightly different character, is what the entire adaptation is doing in miniature. Every choice the show has made has produced a Mark who is both faithful to and distinct from the Mark of the comic, and the result is a character who has shaped the cultural understanding of Invincible in ways the comic alone could never have done. The same is true of every other major character in the show. The Nolan of the show is the Nolan of the comic with a fuller voice. The Debbie of the show is the Debbie of the comic with a fuller interior life. The Amber of the show is the Amber of the comic with substantially more screen time and substantially more agency. The Eve of the show is the Eve of the comic, with an entire episode dedicated to her backstory. The Cecil of the show is the Cecil of the comic, with a fuller institutional context and a clearer set of moral compromises. None of these characters has been replaced by something different. Each of them has been deepened, broadened, given more time and more attention, and the cumulative effect of all of those deepenings is that the show feels emotionally heavier than the comic, even when the events depicted are largely the same. The choices the show has made have not all been the right ones. There are sequences the comic handles with a particular kind of efficiency that the show, in slowing down, has sometimes diluted. There are characters the comic captures with a particular kind of sharp, incisive presence that the show, in giving them more time, has sometimes softened. There are moments the comic delivers with a particular kind of brutal force that the show, in framing them more carefully, has sometimes muted. The adaptation is not a perfect translation. It is a translation, with all the trade-offs and compromises that translation involves. The comic remains the original, the show remains its own thing, and the differences between them are not all improvements, just as they are not all losses. They are the marks of an adaptation that has tried to find its own voice, while remaining recognizably the same story. The work of accounting for what the show has changed from the comic is itself a kind of ongoing conversation that will continue as long as the show continues, and probably long after. New viewers will come to the comic through the show. Old readers will come to the show carrying their attachments to the comic. The two media will continue to shape each other, and the changes the show has made will continue to be discussed, debated, defended, and criticized by audiences that care about both. The question of what an adaptation owes to its source is a question that has no final answer, and Invincible, in both its forms, is now part of that larger conversation in a way that few superhero properties have been able to achieve. The largest, deepest, and most important change the show has made to the comic is the way it has insisted on the personhood of every character it has touched. The comic, with its serialized pacing and its single-author voice, treated its characters with affection and care, but it could not always afford to give every character the time they would have needed to feel fully realized. The show, with its room of writers and its team of voice actors and its expanded runtime per episode, has been able to give nearly every character a moment of interiority that the comic version did not have. Donald the Cyborg, Andressa the Thraxan Mother, Multipol the Brother, even the Reanimen, in their wordless suffering, even the variant Marks, in their few minutes of life. Each of them has been given a small claim to being a person, and the cumulative weight of all of those claims is what makes the show feel different from the comic at the deepest level. The comic shows you a world full of heroes and villains. The show shows you a world full of people, some of whom happen to be heroes and villains. That shift, more than any specific plot change or casting choice or visual decision, is what the adaptation has done, and it is the change that will continue to define how Invincible is read going forward. Tonight we have gone through a great many of those changes, from the largest structural decisions, like ending the first episode with Nolan's massacre of the Guardians, all the way down to the smallest visual touches, like the gradual reddening of the title sequence and the empty kitchen chair where Nolan used to sit. None of these changes is the entire story of the adaptation by itself. All of them, together, are the story. Every choice the show has made is the work of a creative team, thinking about how to translate one of the most ambitious independent superhero comics ever printed into a medium that demands different things from it. And the cumulative result of all of those choices is a show that exists alongside the comic rather than replacing it, that honors the comic while doing what the comic could not do, that respects the source while finding its own voice. If you have made it this far, thank you for listening. The show, like the comic before it, is built on the slow accumulation of small choices, and there is something fitting about ending a long video on the same kind of accumulation. The Invincible we know now is the product of two media talking to each other, with each one shaping the other. The comic gave the show its bones, its world, and its heart. The show gave the comic a wider audience, a richer cultural context, and a different kind of life. Neither would be quite what it is without the other, and that mutual shaping is, in the end, the most lasting change either medium has produced. The story will continue, the conversation will continue, and somewhere in the long, quiet hours after midnight, viewers will keep turning to it, finding new things in old episodes, hearing new resonances in lines they thought they knew, watching characters they thought they understood reveal themselves all over again. That ongoing rediscovery is the gift the adaptation has given us, and it is the gift that will outlast any particular ending. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.